Hello and good evening. Tonight's gentle journey takes us to Victorian London Street, gangs Old Nichol, the 40 Elephants, and the rise of hooligans. Lower the volume, rest your eyes, and let the past be your lullaby. If this brings you peace, consider liking and subscribing only if it truly helps, and share in the comments where you're joining us from and the hour there. Now, lights down, a soft fan if you have one, and let's begin our walk through history. When you build a civilization, scavengers gather at its storehouses. In 19th century London, those storehouses were abundant dockside warehouses, counting houses, new factories, teeming markets, and, tucked close by, whole neighborhoods of want. The city's population rose from roughly 1 million at the century's dawn to many times that number by its end, a tide of hands and boots pressing through brick, soot, and gaslight. Industrialization tugged families off the fields. Migrants stepped ashore with bundles and stitched hopes. The result was a metropolis where wealth and misery lived a doorway apart, elegant squares and polished clubs, a short carriage ride from Warren-like courts. The notorious rookeries, where air stood still and the days smelled of coal, damp wool, and gin. It was inside those narrow courts that the Victorians imagined a separate species, a dangerous class, born to crime, professional in vice. Yet the reality of the street gang was more complicated and more human. Some groups were nothing more than friendship rings of local roughs in Whitechapel or Hoxton, lads who drank together, fought together, and scattered when a whistle cut the night. Others were sharper crews with a trusted fence and a preferred line of work pickpockets at fairs, lifters in department stores, bruisers who practiced robbery with violence. A few hardened into something like syndicates, with rules, discipline, and recognizable leaders. Some drew their identity from a single street or court. Others formed around ethnic ties or around specialized trades. Many flared briefly and vanished. A few became long-standing fraternities that passed their name and their grudges from elder brothers to younger ones. What unified them was less an oath than an environment, overcrowding, chronic underemployment, and the scarcity of legitimate opportunity forged tight brotherhoods of the desperate. Competition for survival was daily, intimate work. To keep a bed in a doss house, to quiet a landlord for one more week, to eat something besides bread, these were reasons to move in packs. Youths banded together for protection and for profit, and some learned to rule entire streets by intimidation, their reputations doing what cudgels might otherwise do. In such places, being known mattered. A lad feared for using his boots freely could pass unmolested. A lad thought weak might be tripped by his own neighbors. Fix the map in your mind. Stand by the bank and walk east along Commercial Street. You're in Whitechapel. Spitalfields lies just to the north and west. Bethnal Green a little further on. South across the river spreads Southwark and the junction at the Elephant. Westward begin the theaters and bright shop fronts, the West End boulevards where money pooled under window light. A boy could tramp from the Nichol to the Strand and back between dusk and last orders, returning either light-footed or heavy with a fistful of handkerchiefs and a fresh black eye. The conditions that incubated gangs were plain to anyone who looked. Rooms meant for two might shelter 6. A single window often opened onto a shaft of brick, shared standpipes, foul yards, and unlit passages made places to hide and to spring. Policing was young and thin. A constable on his beat could not split himself to watch every yard, and the maze of courts behind the high roads formed a city within a city. In that shadowed terrain, order belonged to the reputations people made for themselves. A lodging house keeper who enforced quiet could be obeyed like a sergeant. A beer house, known as a fences haunt, cast its own kind of authority over the lane. Insisting on complexity is not a way of polishing halos on hard men. Violence, like gin, ran hot. Street fights were part a sport, part a schooling. Bootings were lessons in consequence. In rooms where thin walls made witnesses of everyone, the thud of domestic abuse set a rhythm of dread. Yet the boundary between respectable poverty and the underworld was porous. The costermonger who sold you eels in the morning might know a man who could recover your watch by night for a fee. A woman who kept a clean lodging could also buy small items with no questions asked if it meant paying the coalman on time. The gang, in this context, was less an alien import than a local adaptation protection, identity, a way to turn risk into rent. The popular imagination, hungry for clean narratives, preferred sharper lines. Dickens had already given the world Fagin and his pocket-picking boys. A generation later, newspapers splashed the garroting scare across their posters, tense columns warning of ruffians who choked gentlemen from behind on public streets. Lurid woodcuts traveled faster than nuance. By the 1880s, the East End had hardened in the public mind into a byword for danger, and fear crested during the Whitechapel murders. Before the figure of a Lona killer settled into legend, it seemed reasonable to speculate that a gang might be responsible for at least some early attacks that bore the marks of group assault. Panic loves company, and the press obliged. Most gangs, however, were not secret societies of assassins. A great many were short-lived cohorts of youths whose specialties ran to brawling, snatch theft, and the sudden rush at a watch chain. Others matured into longer-lived fraternities, their names taken from the courts they haunted: Old Nichol, Hoxton Market, Greengate. On rare occasions, one encountered crews with a clear division of labor distractor at the counter, the dip with the fingers, the stickman waiting outside to receive and vanish, each taking a share according to risk. The word gang itself did as much to inflate as to describe. It could mean a named crew with regular haunts and a habitual fence, or merely a handful of local roughs who teamed up for a night and scattered by morning. Press language thickened the myth. Reporters sold papers with talk of foreign tigers and high rips, while police pocketbooks filled with names, addresses, and associates. A poor boy whose name appeared too often in those pages might be treated as a permanent menace, whatever the charge at hand. By contrast, a well-dressed woman caught shoplifting in a West End emporium might meet the soft glove of embarrassment, even pity, and walk home under the genteel diagnosis of kleptomania. Class bent the lens. The image returned was never neutral. To hear the logic of the streets, listen to one night, a constable turns a corner into a crescent of darkness, counting his paces as trained. From a gin palace 2 streets over, a cheer swells and breaks with the clink of glass. In the courts behind, a watcher on a doorstep murmurs a warning when a stranger's gait reads wrong. At a draper's counter, a girl in a borrowed hat laughs a shade too brightly while a friend's fingers work the pile of mufflers. Across the way, the ascetic man receives what's passed and looks, if challenged, like any honest passerby. None of this is novel. All of it is practice. Hunger and opportunity meet, and a method is born. Geography helped. Lanes were narrow, routes crooked, lighting inconsistent, and rents, despite the filth, stubbornly high. Landlords charged what the market would bear because shelter near work, however foul, was still shelter. For boys at loose ends and girls with few choices, the gang offered a kind of apprenticeship protection when other lads came hunting, introductions to beerhouse customs, an audience for bravery, and a share in spoils that might, for 1 week more, hold the landlord at bay. It was not destiny, but it was a door that stood open. This, then, is the story before our stories, a city that manufactures gangs by the ordinary operations of growth and neglect. The underworld did not stand apart from London so much as under it, pressed into the gaps between shop and court, between wages promised and wages withheld. If we remember that, the names you'll hear in the parts ahead, the Old Nichol roughs, the blind beggar mob, the elephant's women, will sound less like monsters and more like products of their streets. The shocks will come near from invention, but from proximity. How near the glitter walked to the grime. How the same cobbles served both. Keep the map within reach, keep the lamps low, and follow the footfalls. Our walk has only begun. Draw closer to the street, and the city arranges itself into layers, like wallpaper pasted one atop another until the seams show. On the surface were the promenades and polished stone, gentlemen's clubs that hushed the clatter behind velvet curtains, and gas globes that turned night into respectable amber. A few minutes' walk away, the light thinned, the paving lifted, and London disclosed its other face, tight courts, leaning brick, a wilderness of backways where children learned the city by touch. The juxtaposition was not a trick of distance, but the ordinary geography of 19th century life. Wealth and squalor touched shoulders. An evening carriage could pass from Mayfair to Whitechapel in the time it took to hum a tune, and in that time cross an empire of difference, one world measured in credit and invitations, the other in rent day and the coal scuttles a scrape. The worst afflicted quarters, the east and south districts, were more than districts on a map. They were pressures contained by masonry. Whitechapel and Spitalfields, Bethnal Green and Shoreditch to the east, Suffolk and Lambeth across the river, these places became bywords for the rookery, those dense knots of courts and alleys where rooms were cut and cut again until air itself seemed taxed. A single chamber might house a family with a baby, an aunt, a lodger who came in after the pubs closed, and a boarder who worked nights and slept by day. Windows opened onto brick lightwells so narrow a man could grip both sides. The stair rails were polished by hands, not beeswax. In summer, the heat sat in the landing like a body. In winter, the damp climbed the walls and flowered into spots. The city's bowels ran close to the surface here. Sanitation, where it existed, was a shared experiment, a privy in the yard, a standpipe at the corner that ran at certain hours if frost spared the pipes. The night's contents were bucketed and carried. Spillage was nobody's business until the smell made it everybody's business. Rain turned the unpaved courts to paste, street lighting thinned to darkness, and the Metropolitan Police, young as an institution and spread across too many miles, could not convert maze into map. A constable had his beat and his time, a gang had the remainder. Even the bricks conspired with secrecy. Houses pressed to the edge of narrow ways so that a watcher could hear a heel strike long before the man who made it could see a doorway's shape. If poverty kept people in place, paradox kept them paying. Rents did not drop to meet the quality of the rooms. They rose to match the appetite for proximity. Work clustered near docks, markets, workshops, yards, and so did beds. A lodging house got away with damp because it stood a 10-minute walk from a man's day labor stand. A landlady charged for a mattress because the alternative was a doorstep. Landlords were not a new species of villain in this arrangement, only its natural beneficiaries, where demand was permanent and choices were scarce. A shilling bought exactly what the market decreed it should, no more, no less, and never enough. The social stratification of Victorian Britain ran through these streets like mortar. Reformers, clerics, journalists, and officials took notes and new words out into the air. Residual classes, the residuum, the criminal class terms that sounded like science and behaved like judgments. To name people as a sediment at the bottom of the social beaker was to imply they had settled there by nature. Dehumanization did work for policy. If a neighborhood could be sketched as a nether realm of vice and filth, then stern policing could be described as cleansing, harsh sentencing as moral hygiene. It is not that no crime flourished, it did, but that the lens through which misdeeds were seen bent with class. A theft in a drawing room could be a nervous affliction, an episode to be handled discreetly. A theft in a yard off Brick Lane could be proof of a tribe. Daily life made the case for gangs long before anyone used the word. In a rookery, every sound had a meaning. A coalman's call, the way a door was pushed, the shut of a window at an hour when decent folk slept. Children learned the difference between noise and alarm younger than they learned their letters. Men learned that leaving a beer house alone and late was an invitation. Women learned that a certain corners asked for company and eyes that will stay steady. Darkness educated without lessons. In alleys where a stranger could not be seen 10 paces off, reputation walked farther than boots. A crew's name, its habit of stepping in when one of its own was threatened. The quickness with which it retaliated 100 small performances of solidarity wrote a kind of insurance policy on the street. It did not help that public provisions for the poor were crafted with a logic that prized deterrence. The poor law offered the workhouse or a night in a casual ward bread, a pallet, and morning labor that hurt the hands a stone to be broken. Oakum to be picked before the ticket to leave was printed. Men who queued in cold rain for a bed learned that relief was a narrow door with humiliation hung above it. Many preferred the doss house, where a few coins bought a bunk in anonymity. The line between lawful survival and illicit earnings wore thinner, where wages came irregularly and mouths did not. A man who waited all day at a wharf gate and was passed over might by nightfall be ready to serve as lookout for a friend bent on burglary. A woman who missed a day's charring and saw the landlord's face turn to brick in the doorway might agree to pass on a bolt of fabric, no questions asked, for a cut. From the vantage of drawing rooms and committee halls, the same scene appeared a moral failing. Reformers described habits of improvidence, a taste for drink, laxity of character, but even their own surveys told on them wages contracted and rooms expanded in occupancy as the century broadened, apprenticeships withered with the old trades. Small masters failed under the pressure of mechanized production. Seasonal work at the docks meant that a good week could be followed by a barren one through no man's fault. The poor punished for not saving were often those for whom saving was fantasy. Into those openings stepped the informal economies of the street, the fence at the beer house who could turn a watch into rent, the woman who bought and sold pawn tickets like a stockbroker of hunger, the crew that made a lane feel safer to its own while extracting coin from those who were not. Night reordered the geography yet again. Gas standards flared along the high roads, but behind them the courts fell back into a gloom the eye could not settle. Here a gang had natural assets, blind corners, flight routes, rooftop paths known to children and cats. A watchman's rattle warned and warned too late. Boots on cobble told stories to anyone practiced in listening. The very design of the rookery made policing reactive. To deter meant to be seen, and to be seen where vision failed was a problem that could not be solved by orders alone. So control defaulted to those who could occupy space with reputation. A gang that could keep a costermonger's cart safe in its own strip of market might, the next street over, tax a stall for the privilege of standing at all. Language finished what bricks began. To call these places Jago or Old Nichol or Devil's Acre was to turn location into legend. Newspapers pleased their subscribers with sketches of a hidden city beneath the city, complete with passwords, dens, and hierarchies sensible to readers of sensation novels. It is not that such things never existed. It is that their portrait was painted without background. Alongside the thieves were the laundry women who rose in the dark to stoke boilers. The tailors bent 12 hours over coats, the costers who lived above their barrows. They occupied the same lanes, breathed the same air, and were counted with the same word, slum, when those outside peered in. Against that flattening, the gang stood out sharp because it looked like an answer, a way to make the street do as you wished for once. And so the city taught its lessons. Overcrowding made kin of strangers. Lighting and layout made hiding places. Thin wages and irregular work made temptation into arithmetic. The social gaze hardened into labels that excused force. In that matrix, the gang did not need to be invented. It simply condensed. Before we follow names and cases deeper into the alleys, before we meet crews that Londoners feared by title, it helps to hold this ground in mind. The gang was not an import. It was a structure raised out of circumstance, nailed together with necessity, and lit by the same gas that made the grand boulevards glow. The same city built both. The same night fell on both. London did not fill itself only by childbirth and chance. It was fed by roads, rails, and tides. Through the first half of the century, men and women left hedged fields and granite coasts because machines had changed the mathematics of work. A thresher could do what 10 hands once did. A factory could pay pennies across a week that a cottage loom could not match in a month. The capital pulled like a lodestone. You could follow the iron lines right into it, a trunk line to a soot-black terminus, then a walk behind a barrowman toward the docks, the yards, the markets, where a man might find a foreman willing to nod. The first migrants were not foreign at all, but English farm lads, now laborers, girls who had kept dairy, now in service, men who once knew hedgerows, now shouldering hods on brickfield walls. They came with parish names stitched into memory and learned new ones. St. George in the East, St. Giles, St. Luke, because a parish was still a kind of address even after the city has swallowed the countryside. Into that steady inland drift, catastrophe poured a second current. The 1840s famine in Ireland turned hunger into movement. Some came first to Liverpool and then across by coaster or cheap rail to the capital. By the 1850s, the Irish-born were a familiar presence in the east and south, clustering where rents were lowest and work was within walking distance. They took the hardest, heaviest jobs navvy gangs on the new lines, hod carriers up ladders, nightmen in yards, dockside day laborers who learned to wake to the whistle and run for a place at the gate. Women found work in laundries as charwomen, in kitchens, where the hours were long and the pay small but regular. The accent, its music unmistakable, became part of the soundscape of Whitechapel and Southwark as surely as the clatter of barrows and the bark of the costers. The city met the Irish with the same mixture it reserved for most arrivals' need and suspicion. Employers needed muscle, and they paid for it. Neighbors in crowded houses found a fresh family at the stairhead meant one more claim on the standpipe and the yard. Prejudice worked quickly in tight spaces. Old lines of religion and island a story crossed, with new resentments about wages undercut and rooms dearer than ever. And yet life stitched connections in spite of itself. Catholic parishes formed nets that kept people from falling all the way. A priest who would write a line to a landlord, a society that would lend a few shillings for coals, a neighbor who knew a foreman who might be hiring come Monday. Pubs learned to serve on tick to men whose wages arrived 4 days out of 7. The fragile economies of trust that kept the poor going did not recognize clean borders at the bottom. They were improvised and local and as practical as the day's weather. What did all this mean for the underworld competition sharpened? A district that yesterday had a free bunk in a doss house and a basket left unwatched outside a shop now had neither, where work was irregular. Men took irregular work. A crew that had once been enough to keep a lane safe at night found it had to prove itself against boys from 2 parishes over who were equally hungry and just as ready to make a name. The same scarcity that hardened elbows at the dock gate hardened tempers on the street. Some gangs acquired a caste, a sound in their talk or a way they gathered that reflected where their members' mothers came from. It was not ethnicity rendered as manifesto so much as neighborhood rendered as habit. The pubs you knew, the jokes you understood, the prayers you had learned to say. A generation later, a different tide reached the East End. In the 1880s and 1890s, families fleeing violence and restriction in Eastern Europe, especially from the zones where Jews were required to live, found their way to London by routes that were a geography of fear. A man might leave a town by night with a name in his pocket, pass by stages to a port he had never seen, and arrive in the city used to foreign ships and foreign tongues. Whitechapel and Spitalfields offered what cities always offer the newcomers spaces others already thought unlivable, and the chance, however thin, of work that could begin tomorrow. Whole streets learned new rhythms. Friday evenings dimming early, Saturday mornings quiet, a babel of market cries flavored now by a tongue that sounded like a cousin of German and was not. Work followed craft. Many of the new arrivals brought needle skills, and the East End's back rooms quickened into tailoring shops where the day was measured in seams and the wage in finished pieces. Shirt making, coat making, cap making, cigar rolling trades that could be carried in the hands grew behind shutters lined with newspaper against the draft. The sweater, the middleman who parceled out work, took his cut. The men and women who stitched through lamplight took what remained. A boy might carry bundles up and down stairs until he was old enough to hold the needle full time. Mutual aid societies, landsmen groups, where countrymen from the same towns met, gathered coins for burials and for weeks when work went aslack. Tiny schools taught children letters they already half knew from prayers. The East End changed, not in a single turn of the key, but in a dozen daily scenes, herring in the pan on a Friday. Hebrew letters and chalked on a board. An older woman is scolding in a language the milkman didn't speak. Suspicion came too, as it always did, and with it the headlines. The press liked to write the city as a menagerie, Odessians, Bessarabians, and worse labels that made people sound like a species, rather than neighbors, appeared above columns that reported fights or thefts, as though they proved something about everyone who shared a tongue. Where the English poor had been a residuum, the foreign poor were an influx. Each word carried a little poison, and yet the street-level arithmetic remained what it had always been: too many bodies for too little space, too many hands for too few jobs, and a night that offered either rest or risk. If some crews in those years took on a distinct accent in their membership, they did so in the way gangs everywhere do, because friends run with friends, and because one man's cousin brings another when work, however illicit, might be had. None of this is to pretend that harmony reigned. The East End was noisy with quarrels long before any newcomer stepped off a train, and it stayed noisy after. Boys fought for corners. Men resented the drop in piece rates the sweaters imposed as competition thickened. Landlords took advantage of tenants whose paperwork was as thin as their mattresses. Those with the least power learned fastest to bargain with whatever they possessed, a speed at a machine, a willingness to work a Sabbath in violation of conscience when rent loomed, a sturdy frame ready to carry a barrel 3 flights for a penny more. The ways of surviving fattened and thinned alongside the ways of stealing. Gangs took what they had always taken from the city's churn recruits. The police learned new names for the same old things. An assault in a yard where Yiddish was spoken sounded in a report like a kind of novelty. When it was only the same story, men whose patience with one another had run out in a place designed to test patience. A robbery by 3 boys with foreign surnames became part of an argument about strangers, while a robbery by 3 boys named Smith and Jones became part of an argument about the slums. The patterns of explanation altered. The pattern of need did not, and under the explanations, within the need, the gang went on forming and reforming a machine for turning proximity and fear into action. There were two quiet solidarities that never made print. A Jewish tailor who had prospered a little might leave a parcel of bread on a doorstep he knew. An Irish charwoman might mind a neighbor's children for an hour in the early dark while the neighbor ran to the yard for water. A Catholic woman and a Jewish woman could and did complain in the same voice about a landlord's indifference to a leaking roof, because water finds the same path down any wall, and cold meets any hand with the same bite. The city's official talk boards and minutes and debates rarely recorded such cross-grained kindness, but it was there, and it cut across the hardening labels that the newspapers and the pulpit preferred. In the midst of all this, the reputation of the East End settled into its familiar shape. For middle-class readers, it became a theater of anxiety, a place where the foreign and the poor and the young turned alleyways into plots. The gangs that operated there, some with names that traveled, some that never did, were easily painted with the broadest brush immigrant roughs, Irish ruffians depending on which neighbor a writer already feared. The truth, less satisfying to panic, was that gangs grow where cities grow without care. They were strengthened by crowding, by darkness, by wages that staggered, by rooms that cost more than they were worth, by the feeling English, Irish, Jewish alike that the rules were written elsewhere and enforced only here. Stand again at the point where Commercial Street meets Whitechapel Road and watch the worlds pass. Across one another, a woman with a basket of lace, a boy in an apron running a message, a man with a cap pulled low who knows to glance twice at the shadow near the alley mouth, and behind them the constant traffic of tongues. Out of that traffic, the gangs we will meet took their members. Some spoke with Irish music, some with East End Yiddish cadences, some with the flat of London, born from parents who had arrived 2 decades before. They shared more than they would have admitted, an intimacy with hunger and a map of the city at night that most respectable London never learned. The city filled and refilled itself from without and within. And in the seams, always in the seams, the street learned to organize. By night, the city taught its lessons most clearly. A watchman shouldered his pole and traced a round he could have walked blindfolded along the high road, past the Gin Palace door where laughter was too loud to be joy, down into the side streets where the gas thinned and the stars reclaimed the cobbles. Shutters were drawn early in the narrow courts. You could hear the bar drop into its iron catch as if the house itself were bracing for a blow. Cats moved like water along the walls. A woman tipped slops into a bucket and winced at the splash on her shoes. Somewhere, much too near. A door rattled in its frame under a man's temper, then fell quiet, then rattled again. It was in such hours that the raw materials of a gang, fear, hunger, caution, opportunity, separated themselves from daylight's business and showed what they were. Living conditions did not merely accompany crime, they manufactured the incentives and the spaces for it. Sanitation was a patchwork. Yards shared a single privy. Standpipes ran when they chose. Drains failed and turned courts into shallow lakes that remembered every boot that had crossed them. Lighting was generous on the show streets and grudging in the lanes that fed them. A lamplighter's ladder could not reach everywhere, and where light failed, the city folded into blind corners, sudden turns, and passages so narrow that two men could not pass without deciding who would yield. Policing, new, earnest, and outnumbered, spread itself into the interstices as best it could and found there was never enough of it to go around. The Metropolitan Police worked on the logic of the beat. A constable walked a circuit, the size of which was an equation written by superiors who had maps rather than footsteps in mind. He carried a truncheon, later a whistle, and an understanding that help was a matter of distance and chance. There were no radios and few shortcuts. Sound itself had to run for assistance. If he startled a thief in a yard, the thief had a dozen exits that the constable did not. If he heard a woman cry out 3 courts away, the cry was old by the time he reached its source. Good men did what good men could, and in the gaps a different kind of order arose, one that was measured in reputations and debts rather than in warrants. Overcrowding turned inconvenience into pressure. Rooms meant for 2 or 3 held 6 or 7. A boy slept across the foot of a bed where 2 adults lay and learned to wake at the right moments and to pretend not to hear at others. If he left a school early because there was a market barrow to pull, because there was nothing left to wear that could be called decent. He discovered daylight hours with nothing to do but stand where other boys stood and watch who crossed the lane without a glance. Unemployment was not an idea to debate in a coffee house. It was a stomach asking a question at 4 in the afternoon. A week at the docks with full wages could be followed by 10 days of nothing, and the landlord's mouth set hard at the mention of grace. Social observers, walking the courts with notebooks and tight lips, drew the line as they saw it, deprivation on one side, youth bands on the other. They heard what the street said plainly, that in quarters, where every man's hand could be turned against his neighbor, boys grouped for mutual defense first and for predation next. The order was not always so tidy, but the progression existed. A handful of friends learned to walk the same way home from a beer house, then learned to walk behind a stranger at the right distance, then learned that a hand closed over a mouth is quieter than a shout, answered by a dozen windows. The gang was not born from romance or from an oath, but from the mathematics of being small and wanting to be larger than circumstance allowed. Violence, casual and constant, did its part to train everyone in the premises of force. Street fights began with looks and ended with boots, and the boy who did not learn both to give and to avoid such instruction soon learned to stay indoors or to leave the district altogether. Drunken brawls spilled across thresholds and taught the bystander his place. Keep your eyes somewhere else unless you intended to make yourself part of the story. Domestic abuse crashed through thin walls and made witnesses of those who could do nothing but count the blows as a kind of prayer. When brutality is background, the first blow in a robbery feels less like a crossing of a line and more like an application of a rule you have seen enforced every week. Infrastructure-abetted method. Unlit corners were not just dark, they were tools. An alley that kinked abruptly made the perfect stage for a sudden rush at a watch chain, a press against a wall, a pair of knees behind the victims, a hand in a pocket. a getaway into the next kink, where a stickman waited to receive whatever changed hands. A row of doors opening directly onto the street offered 6 exits in the time it took a constable's whistle to bring help once doss houses, with their constant traffic and layers of anonymity, provided both recruiting offices and safe rooms, where the names of fences were traded softly between bunks. Beer houses that served as informal labor exchanges by day turned, after closing, into places where arrangements were made and shares divided. Employment patterns wrote the gang's schedule. On days when the yard paid, the beer houses were noisy and the lads generous. On the days after the yard paid, purses were light and tempers shorter, and an evening walk along the high road looked more like a market of risks and opportunities. Men who had done a week's honest labor could still be 2 shillings short because an illness had kept a wife from work, or because coals had doubled in price. In that arithmetic, a single watch chain taken at dusk, fenced for a fraction of its value, quieted the landlord for long enough to find the next job. We do not varnish this, we describe it in the terms its actors used: rent, meat, boots, gin, and the nearer horizon of consequences. The gang's inner logic followed from its outer one. Loyalty was practiced before it was promised. A crew that would step in when one of its own was cornered gained a reputation the way a shop gains custom. The promise of protection, once it took root, could be monetized bluntly. A stallholder who paid a shilling each week discovered that his shutters were never kicked in. A costermonger who refused discovered that a wheel could be broken at noon with 2 quick blows, and no one in the market seeing anything at all. These were small tyrannies, local as a parish boundary and just as jealously kept. As often as not, the money extracted stayed within the same streets, cycling back into beer and pawn tickets and rent. But the authority gained by the gang spent itself more freely. To say that gangs offered livelihood is not to grant them a nobility they did not possess. It is to recognize that an illicit economy existed because a licit one failed to absorb all who needed absorbing. Some crews specialized racecourse dips who worked the West End crowds and retreated east by night, lifters who knew every counter and every blind spot in the new emporiums, roughs whose talent lay in intimidation and speed. Others were generalists, ready to seize whatever presented itself. A gang's cohesion was often as simple as the shared tenancy of a lodging house or the regular attendance at a certain beer house. Kinship thickened the ties. Brothers and cousins stood shoulder to shoulder, not because a charter told them so, but because home was 2 doors down and a mother's face had to be met at breakfast. Meanwhile, the moral vocabulary of those who judged them grew harsher. Respectable commentators detailed the taste for idleness and criminal propensities, as though children picked these from hedgerows. The poor heard these verdicts and understood that they were to be watched as a class. Under that gaze, concealment became habit. Windows were curtained early, names were given carefully. Anonymity was the currency that bought safety. Into that hush, the gang fit neatly. It was a means to reduce exposure by substituting the collective's reputation for the individual's. A boy alone was a suspect. 6 boys together, known to be quick with their boots, were left to their own lane unless a constable's courage and timing happened to coincide. A single evening can stand for many. The watchman comes around again, tapping a shutter with his pole, the signal that reminds the house the law still remembers it exists. Inside, children settle into corners on pallets. In the court, a pair of boys share a crust and speak in very low voices about a man with a chain who passes the same way every Thursday after the theaters close. At the mouth of the alley, a woman ties her shawl tighter and waits for a neighbor. Nobody sensible crosses the stretch between the rag shop and the butcher's alone after the lamp are put out. Far off, a whistle blows brief, high, and then again, and the sound rattles around the brick until you cannot tell which direction it came from. In that confusion, decisions are made. The gang is not an idea in such a moment. It is a solution. From these conditions, the rest of our story grows without surprise. Poor lighting and poorer prospects, alleyways that fold like paper, thin policing on long beats, rooms pressed past endurance, wages that come late or not at all. None of this excuses what the gangs did, and none of it makes their victims less harmed. It does, however, explain why groups of boys and men, and not a few women, learn to move together, to act together, and to claim pieces of the night as if they owned them. When we follow named mobs into particular lanes and cases, keep this incubator in the mind's eye. The city did not merely contain gangs, it built them quietly, night by night, out of its own bricks and errors. Stories taught London what to fear long before the statistics tried to correct the lesson. A whole generation grew up with Dickens's Oliver Twist, the dim, clammy London where a fox-eyed fence educates boys to the delicate surgery of pockets. Fagin's Den was an earlier time's rookery, but it lingered in the mind as a template, an underworld organized in smoky rooms. Children apprenticed to vice as though it were a trade. Fiction did not invent the city's criminal subculture, but it did give countless readers a picture frame. Once you owned that frame, you could hold it up to any dark alley and swear you recognized the shapes inside. The underworld was now something you could imagine without ever stepping east of Aldgate. Then came newspapers with a daily appetite for alarm. In the 1860s, the garroting panic spread like a bruise across the public mind. The word itself imported. Exotic had a hiss to it. Reports told of respectable men throttled from behind in the very center of town, their pockets relieved as their breath faltered. Lurid engravings sold the sensation silhouettes of attackers looping a cord around a gentleman's throat beneath a gas lamp, newly made sinister by shadow. Evening bills outside the news vendor's booth promised fresh outrage as the last edition went to press. Tradesmen quietly did good business in anti-garroting collars, stiff bands with the spikes or plates meant to defeat the strangler's grip, grimly practical tokens of fear you could fasten at your neck like a penitent's chain. It mattered little that many assaults were clumsy or opportunistic, or that some tales grew in the retelling. Once the city had named the threat, every chokehold whispered garroter, panic-bred policy. Judges rediscovered the lash for robbery with violence, and Parliament obliged with measures that reassured respectable nerves. Punishments grew exemplary, yet even as the alarms waned, the imaginative map remained altered. A shared vocabulary now existed for a hidden city within the city garroters at the corner. dens beyond the lawful streets, secret hierarchies conducted in thieves' cant. You could walk this strand and feel watched by a caricature the press itself had drawn. By the late 1880s, the East End had hardened into shorthand. Say Whitechapel, and you meant not a parish, but a mood. The streets were poor, yes, and often desperate. The newspapers made them dreadful. And then 1888 arrived with its calendar of terror. The murders we fold today under a single proper noun did not at first present themselves as the work of a single hand. Early attacks, especially those that did not fit the later pattern, were read through an older Lynn's gang's roughs, men who hunted in threes. Emma Smith's case set the tone. On a spring night, she was assaulted by more than one attacker. She named 3 before she died. Her death was listed among the Whitechapel murders, even as later histories moved her to the edge of the canonical. To those who took their fear from a street corners rather than memoirs, her testimony made sense of the city as they knew it. Groups of men ruled lanes after dark. They extorted. They punished. They punished women most of all. If murder had followed, it was a miserable continuity rather than a new species of crime. For weeks, the press and a number of officials entertained the notion that a gang might be responsible for at least some of the outrages. The city already believed in gangs. It was simpler to extend that belief than to imagine a solitary monster working with surgical calm. Headlines speculated about local mobs with turf to defend and women to terrorize for tribute. Contemporaries noted that certain victims had been seen in the company of groups shortly before harm found them, and the East End was no stranger to collective assault, rushing a drunk, choking a man to silence him before retrieving his chain, crowding a corner to make witnesses disappear into their own thresholds. In that context, it was natural to think in plurals. Fear does not respect city limits. Newspapers far from London rehearsed the details in provincial inks. In Liverpool, where the High Rip gang had recently made itself infamous with blades and bravado, columnists asked whether that style of violence had assailed the South with the railway timetables. High Rip became, like garroter, a shapely word that allowed any assault with a knife to be read as part of a fashion, rather than as a crime committed by one impulsive man. The public love of pattern did its old work. Knit 3 incidents together and you have a terror with a nickname. Add a 4th and you have a craze. At street level, fear organized itself. Vigilance committees formed in the East End, men with stout hearts and the stouter sticks, promising to patrol where the police seemed too few. They lit corners with borrowed lanterns, promised to raise alarms, shared rumors with the zest of men at last given something to do in the face of helplessness. Their presence made the lanes feel briefly claimed by local resolve, but they also fed the theater. Now there were eyes and boots and whispers at every junction, and the press had new scenes to sketch citizens hunting shadows the law could not catch, while detectives narrowed their theories toward a single killer. The neighborhoods carried on living inside the plural, because the plural had always been there. The gang frame had other uses. It allowed moralists to speak of pestilences and nests and broods, dehumanizing collectives with an ease that individual names sometimes deny. If a crew of roughs ruled a corner, then a stern action could be cast as a civic hygiene, rather than as force applied to boys whose lives the city had already mapped into a narrow future. If a woman was attacked by a gang, sensation could be stoked and pity complicated by the suspicion that she had been on their turf, as though geography carried consent in it as stones. The language of infestation did what such language always does: it made cruelty feel corrective. Yet even at the height of alarm, the record is more mixed than the posters suggest. Not every loud word about organized stranglers corresponded to a conspiracy. Many a gang was no more than three youths who had decided to be bolder than they were wise. Police notebooks tell a story of fluid groups' faces recurring with different companions, loyalties shifting, leaders little more than boys who walked quickly and punched first. Where the newspapers conjured hierarchies and oaths, the courts more often found opportunists whose planning ran no further than tonight's pint and tomorrow's pawn ticket. The truth is not comforting. Opportunists can be crueler than strategists, but it is plainer, and still, the stories mattered. Dickens's boys had taught readers to think of child thieves as creatures of a den. The garroting scare had taught them to imagine sudden violence as a citywide fashion. The East End murders taught them to keep the map of fear fixed east of Bishopsgate, even when theory shifted to a lone butcher. The underworld's picture hardened until it could be reproduced at rookery, courts as a stage, gangs as chorus, a victim as a spectacle, the law as a late entry. This was not mere embroidery. Perception changed behavior. Gentlemen avoided streets they had walked without incident for years. Women paired to cross spaces they had navigated alone. Shopkeepers kept a cudgel behind the counter and glanced harder at any youth whose cap sat at a certain angle. The press did not invent caution any more than Dickens invented thieves, but they supplied a soundtrack. Newsboys' cries turned evening into theater-horrid outrage in Whitechapel, and respectable parlors leaned in to listen. Illustrations gave the city a mirror it could hold to its worst angled face. If a constable made an arrest, his whistle became not a tool but a cue in the public imagination. If he failed, the failure proved the script. And so, even as police deduced that the central terror of 1888 was the work of one, the broader fear of many of gangs remained the nightly weather forecast east of the bank, a chance of violence persistent as fog. None of this is to excuse nor to accuse beyond what the record bears. It is to notice that narrative frames do work in the world. They tell us what to look for, whom to fear, what policies to applaud. Once London imagined itself as a double city, one above ground for the respectable, one below for the dangerous class, it found confirmation in every shadow. That imaginative habit did not need data. It needed a sequence of vivid scenes. Dickens gave it one: the garroting panic; another, the Whitechapel murders; the third, that would outlive them all. From scene to scene, the figure of the gang moved as both culprit and chorus, sometimes the doer, sometimes the threat, always close at hand in the mind, even when the timeline required that a single man stood alone in a pool of lamplight. So we carry forward with that caution in our pockets. The gangs we will meet are not figments, and their deeds were no less harmful because newspapers loved them as copy, but the way London learned to see them through fiction, fear, and the press shaped the streets as surely as any knife. Hold that frame up to the next alley and notice how much of what you think you see belongs to the story you brought with you. Think of the East End not as a single neighborhood, but as a chain of small republics stitched edge to edge, each with its own customs and cautions. Whitechapel abutted Spitalfields, which leaned against Bethnal Green, which slid into Shoreditch. The borders were drawn not on maps, but in footsteps where a costermonger loaded his barrow, where a dosshouse keeper knew every face that paid, where a beerhouse landlord nodded to some lads and not to others. In daylight, these parishes were the city's workshops, tailors and cabinet makers, match girls and market traders, hawkers with sing-song cries and carts bright with apples, boots, ribbons. By night, they were training grounds. The very features that made the districts workable: density, familiarity, backways known to the knee, also made them perfect for crews to form, drill, and hunt. Recruitment was easy because it looked like friendship. Boys who shared a stairwell shared a lane. Boys who shared a lane shared a beerhouse corner. Boys who shared a beerhouse corner shared information which pawnbroker never checked too closely, which constable's beat ran a fraction slow, which shopkeeper feared the sound of boots under his shutters. A gang was a habit before it was a name. Names arrived later, usually bestowed by outsiders, written in police books and headlines. Inside the circle, a crew spoke of our lot or the boys, and that vague possessive was enough to fill a court after dark. Hunting grounds were everywhere and specific. The markets, Spitalfields with its piles of greens, Petticoat Lane with its Sunday bustle, offered pockets and purses in crowds so tight a finger could turn a coat lining inside out, without the owner feeling more than a brush. The roads that led toward the West End, especially on theater nights, gave a steady stream of well-dressed passers-by to watch and choose among. The yards behind the high streets, where shutters were bolted and goods were stacked by routine-taught lads, the rhythms of commerce as surely as any apprenticeship taught a trade when the draper's boy carried a stock to the back, when the butcher left his till unguarded to fetch a joint, when the pawnbroker counted coins with his head down. Practice made patterns, and patterns made profit. The taxonomy of gangs ran from the simple to the steady. At the bottom were loose bands of youths, rough and elastic 4 or 5 lads who drank from the same pewter pot and, on a sudden dare, rushed a gentleman for his chain or swarmed a stall to snatch and scatter. They dissolved as quickly as they formed. A night in the cells or a mother's tears could break them for a month. Above them were crews, with preferences pickpocket trios who understood distraction and handoff, pub thieves who watched gin palaces for the moment, when a drunk's head tipped back and his fingers let go of what he had not meant to spend, fairground lifters who followed race dates like seasons, rarer, but talked about with a mixture of fear and respect, were the fraternities with memory names that survived from older brothers to younger, lanes where outsiders still hesitated, even when the old leaders had moved on or been taken up. Turf had a psychology as well as a geography. A cruise, a strip of pavement, was not only a place to work, but a stage where reputation was performed. If a rival cut through, even without malice, his very presence demanded an answer, first a stare, then a word, then if either side felt it must. The square stance and the quick work of fists and boots. Grudges accumulated by inches. A boy's glance at a girl outside her father's shop could start a low fire that, fanned by ale and retelling, turned into a running fight 2 nights later. Police might record it as disorderly conduct. The retreat read it as a boundary stone moved and moved back. The map shifted by scuffle and a story, because the East End was both home and harbor to such groups. It also served as their refuge after forays elsewhere. A day's picking in the West End crowds at the parks, promenades outside theaters, gentlemen distracted by hats and cigarettes, was followed by a walk east along routes rehearsed so often that a man could make them half asleep. A certain muse meant a chance to change a coat, a certain beer house, a landlord who asked no questions, a certain door, a woman with a laugh who bought small goods for cash. The returns to base were as careful as the ventures out. A big hall did not go to a fence in a bright mood. It went to a quiet back room where a lamp was turned low and prices were named without adjectives. The economy that sustained the gangs was local and known. Fences were rarely strangers. They were men who had grown from a smaller trades into the one that paid best for silence. Pawnbrokers served the lawful poor at noon and the unlawful by arrangement after hours. A wedding ring and a stolen watch might pass across the same counter an hour apart, under the same cautious gaze. Beer houses, always conversational by nature, became exchanges after closing who had been taken up. Which magistrate was in anger this week? What price a new fence offered for silver? Doss houses were dormitories and bulletin boards both. A newcomer learned the rules by listening. Keep your tongue short, keep your boots near. Do not boast where a stranger can hear you. And if you must boast, boast of past raids far from here. Women's roles, though less often named, were woven through the pattern. A girl with a decent dress could be the best decoy at a counter. A woman with a baby in arms could stand near a door and look like nothing at all while a parcel shifted hands. A landlady could be the difference between a midnight knock from the police and a door that never heard the knock at all. Some women ran small economies of their own buying, holding, and redistributing goods with a strict eye for margin, and kept their houses in order with a discipline that shamed crews who fancied themselves hard men. The line between accomplice and entrepreneur was as thin as the room's partition. Signals made a language. A cough in a court held a meaning if it came on a second beat. A boy's hop from curb to cobble could tell a watcher at the corner which way a potential victim had turned. A whistle too low for a constable at the far end of the lane to hear could make 3 figures vanish into a doorway as if the brick had opened for them. These codes were not taught in lessons. They were inherited in the air. A younger lad watched an older one lean a shoulder just so and learned the posture that said not today without a word. Habit became system. If the city's authority appeared thin, the gang's authority filled the visible gap. A stall in a market controlled by a crew enjoyed a weird kind of insurance. The rent was punctual, and the shutters were never forced by uninvited hands. The same crew that took a cut also took offense if an outsider tried to cause trouble inside its patch. In a world with too few straight lines, this crooked protection could look like order A costermonger would grumble and pay because in the short run, payment was cheaper than trying to be brave. The constable, bound to a beat that did not allow him to be everywhere at once, might prefer to keep the peace by speaking quietly to a known lad rather than by making a show that would draw a crowd. Compromise wore the city's uniform as often as courage did. This ecosystem rewarded memory. Boys who could recall a constable's shift change to the quarter hour, who knew which shopkeepers counted change slowly and which glanced down at their ledgers for too long, who remembered the shape of a coat worn by a theater-goer seen twice in a week, rose fastest in the small hierarchy of the street. Intelligence, so called in grander contexts, was simply noticing carefully and telling it to the right ears. A crew that listened survived. A crew that crowed stumbled. The survivors learned to look drab when heat ran high, to break routine before the law guessed it, to change alehouse for a fortnight without souring the landlord, to turn an enemy into a neutral by returning a trivial item found in the lane. None of this meant every lad became a lifer. The slums were as full of departures as of apprenticeships. A boy could marry out of the game, find steady work in a yard that kept him too tired for nights, enlist, and vanish into a regiment where the rules wore braid and were at least legible. But the structure remained for the next crop of boys who reached the age when risk felt like a wage. In that sense, the East End was a machine that made gangs even as it made cabinets and coats, a contraption of need and brick and habit that produced crews as a byproduct of life lived without margin. Walk one evening from Brick Lane down to Fashion Street and across toward Shoreditch, and you can feel the logic under your boots. Doors open straight onto pavement. Lamps fail just where an alley kinks. Voices drop an inch at certain corners and lift again 2 steps later. A barrow creaks in a yard and then stops as though it had never moved. The geography teaches anyone who pays attention how to disappear and how to be seen. It is in those lessons that we should locate what came next, named mobs whose reputations traveled beyond their streets. Before we meet them, the Nichol boys, the Hoxton fighters, the market crews fix this ecosystem in the mind. It grew no leaders from thin air. It bred them, as it bred everything else, out of the ordinary practice of getting by. Say the name softly Old Nichol, and a whole quarter seems to lean closer, as if walls themselves had learned to eavesdrop. In the 1880s, the Old Nichol rookery, a tangle of lanes between Shoreditch and Bethnal Green, had a reputation that traveled ahead of any visitor. Houses sagged into one another with the intimacy of the entirely worn out. Doorsteps sank, courts ended abruptly in brick. The sun, when it visited, arrived in slices. The place bred stories as surely as it bred children. And among those stories was a crew whose title alone could still a tongue, the Old Nichol Gang. The word gang in such districts did not always mean an oath and a captain. Often it meant the hard end of a street's young men, the boys who would not step aside, the men who did not apologize. But in the city's mind, the Old Nichol name signified a something gathered and enduring, a pack that ruled its alleys by right of long occupancy and the willingness to hurt. Little in the official record preserves their roll call or their rules. Much of what survives is the kind of testimony that clings to corners shopkeepers, who spoke of being troubled unless a shilling changed hands, women who warned one another not to walk alone past certain doorways, constables who wrote the same names again and again in pocketbooks without ever being able to prove half of what was said aloud. Violence was the grammar. Robbery with violence was the phrase of the courts. In the courts, it translated into boots used freely, a man's arms pinned while fingers found his chain, a shove that left a head against stone. Extortion was the unprinted business market stalls taxed for the privilege of keeping their shutters whole. Beer houses allowed to trade peaceably in exchange for a quiet agreement about who drank where. One name returns when the public fear of the district turned suddenly toward murder. In April of 1888, Emma Smith was attacked near the east end of Whitechapel Road. She died soon after and told those who tended her that more than one man had set upon her. Before theories shrank toward a single killer, people who lived by the street's rules thought in plurals, and more than a few tongues tied the assault to the roughs of the Nichol and its fringes. Attacks of that sort did not need explanation in the abstract. They belonged to a known practice of intimidation, tribute-taking that punished refusal, a local tyranny enforced at the cost of bodies most easily coerced. Whether a particular crew's hand was provably there mattered less to the quarter than the fact that such hands were always near. The name Old Nichol Gang thus became attached not to a brilliant plot, but to the steady application of fear. Inside the gang, if we use the word for convenience, structure was fluid. Leadership meant two things: a face that others followed in a fight, and a fellow who knew where to sell stolen goods at a fair price. Kinship substituted for constitution. Brothers and cousins stood together by default. The youngest learned how far to stand from a constable by watching the middle ones. Older men 22 and already worn thin by work and nights served as ruinous tutors to boys of 15 and 16 who knew the lanes by blindfold but had not yet learned their own limits. There was no printed code, and yet everyone knew what broke it in forming. The penalty for that sin was enough to make neighbors deaf. Women moved through the economy as deftly as men. A few were decoys at counters, a few quiet buyers of small goods, a few landladies whose houses were as safe as any fortress, so long as the rent came and the rules were obeyed. The Nichol did not exist in a bowl apart. To the west lay Hoxton, with its market and its own supply of toughs. Borders like these are invitations. Pitched fights, part theater, part settlement of a week's worth of small injuries, got named after the parishes involved. Nichol boys and Hoxton lads had a habit of colliding where lanes met, and neither side could pretend not to have seen the other. Accounts speak of stones used as punctuation, knives shown as argument, and the kind of bootwork that left a lane decorated with splashes of someone else's folly. A beaten rival understood the message as clearly as any notice tacked to a wall. This is ours, and if you pass through, mind your eyes and your hands. The police read the fights as disorder. The streets read them as boundary markers. If the Old Nichol gang frightened the imagination of respectable London, a novelist carved the terror into something permanent. Arthur Morrison, who knew the district as more than a rumor, set his 1896 book in a barely disguised Nichol. he called the Jago. He drew a universe where a boy's options narrowed like the court that held his house, join the hard men, and ascend to the high mob, or descend to the gallows with a shrug from God. In Morrison's telling, the Jago is at war with its neighbor, their Dove Lane, an eternal feud with 1,000 petty causes and no end beyond exhaustion or arrest. He caught precisely the feeling that the place itself was a trap, that the streets took you by the ankle as surely as a man could. Readers who had never set foot east of Bishopsgate carried away a picture so vivid that it began to act on the world. The Jago became the Nichol in the mind, and the Nichol, measured against that novel, looked irredeemable. Myth sharpened what reportage had collected, a gang that may have been, in practice, a shifting composite of the district's hardest men and its bolder boys acquired, on the page, the coherence of a regiment. That coherence made the threat legible to people who thought in hierarchies. It also made the response simpler to justify. If the Nichol could be described as a nest of cutthroats rather than as a poverty engine, it was possible to imagine a cure that involved demolishing the machine rather than repairing or feeding it. Neatly colored social surveys of the same years, those famous maps that shaded some streets pale red for fairly comfortable, others dark with the label vicious, semi-criminal, supplied an image that fit the novelist's pages with unnerving ease. The Nichol was black on those maps. Policymakers could point and say there, demolition followed quickly for a Victorian project. In the early 1890s, galvanized by public attention and reforming zeal, authorities cleared the Old Nichol. Houses were condemned, courts were cut open to air and then to the sky. In place of the rookery rose a model estate, a crown of new blocks arranged like the spokes of a wheel around a small green mound and the bandstand order. Sunlight, ceremony where there had been none. When the Boundary Street estate opened at the century's turn, it was shown as proof that you could write a new paragraph over an old sentence. The city congratulated itself on the civilizing power of brick laid straight. It would be neater if the story ended with vice evaporating in the fresh air. What happened was what always happens when you lift the lid. What's inside moves. The people of the Old Nichol thousands did not vanish. Many could not afford the new rents and simply carried their households and their troubles to other cramped streets within walking distance of work. The networks that had made robbery, fencing, and protection reliable in the Nichol did not crumble so much as scatter. A shopkeeper in one lane slept easier. A shopkeeper in another began to learn the names a constable already knew. Crime did not stop at the Boundary's fresh brick. It sought new seams. As a method, slum clearance dissolved a particular address and a particular reputation. As an answer, it mostly changed the map. Still, reputation matters. For a time, to say the Old Nichol gang was to gesture toward the worst that respectable London assumed of the East. The very syllables marked out the kind of place a gentleman would cross himself against. And yet if you walked back into the Nichol before the clearance and paused in a doorway at midday, you would have seen the same mixed ledger you find in any quarter: women boiling shirts over tin tubs, children scraping a slate and learning their sums, an old man standing with a pipe in the doorway as if his body and the lintel were propping one another. a boy running with messages between tailors' rooms, a girl stepping carefully past a puddle with bread under her arm. Among them moved the hard fellows everyone recognized without speaking their names, the ones a mother would instruct a son not to stare at. The gang was not the whole, it was the edge. The edge cuts, and it draws the eye, but it is still only the outline of a something larger. By the last Victorian decade, the Nichol boys' fearsome prestige was already part of a legend the city both half believed and half magnified. That did not make their kicks softer or their extortion gentler, but it invites us to see the machine that made them a rookery, where night was an accomplice. Work was uncertain, and law walked a beat too long for its boots. Morrison's novel held up a mirror that exaggerated, as mirrors do, by placing the face very close to the glass. Reformers used the reflection to argue for demolition. Demolition proved them right about filth and wrong about fate. What dissolved in the wrecker's dust was a name. What persisted was the habit of organizing in the dark. When the Boundary Street estate opened, people came to marvel at the orderly brick and the bandstand's elegant railings. They spoke, with relief, of the Jago gone. They were not entirely wrong. There is a mercy in fresh, clean rooms and in streets that see the sun. But the story of the Old Nichol gang, their rise as a neighborhood's hard edge, their conflicts with the lads of Hoxton, their role in the city's theater of fear, and their quiet dispersal under reforming hammers, reminds us that gangs are not conjured by a name and unmade by a plan. They are fashioned by conditions and unfastened only when the conditions themselves are. Remember the Nichol as we move on to other mobs whose reputations carried far the blind beggar crowd, the Hoxton High Rips, the Green Gate crew. Each lived on a street that taught the same lessons. Each learned them in a slightly different grammar. Not all terrors traveled with the gravity of the Old Nichol name. Some moved lighter, like shadows cast by busy hands. One such was the blind beggar mob, a crew whispered about with a half smile by men who admired neat work even when they pretended not to. Their nickname came ready-made, the Blind Beggar Pub out on the Mile End Road, a landmark as firm in local speech as any church, and a meeting place where a man could vanish into the clink and hum of ordinary trade. Despite their East End roots, their hunting grounds lay westward where money wore better cloth. They were pickpockets with a race course habit, and the West End and the tracks were their hedgerows. Picture an afternoon at Epsom or Ascot, all noise and feathers and wagers, bookmakers bawling odds, gentlemen patting pockets between races, ladies drawing gloves off fingertip by fingertip. The blind beggar lads worked that bustle like musicians. One kept a newspaper as a screen, another jostled, apologizing with a flourish. A third received what moved from lining to hand. The trick was not only in the lift, but in the handoff. A watch chain severed in a breath became a warm watch in a stranger's palm 2 steps later. A purse that had sat secure under a rib cage sighed into a muff and then into a pocket where, if stopped and searched, it could not be found on the man who'd first taken it. They worked the West End much the same way on theater nights, couples idling under lights, men distracted by talk and cigarettes. A good evening ended with a walk east by secreted routes and the quiet industry of converting risk into rent. They knew their customers. these men and their tools. A handkerchief, silk, thick, respectable, served as cover for a delicate pull. A snuff box tested fingers. A pocketbook tested nerve. Rings went only if gin and bravado loosened a gentleman's hand. The crew kept watch for a certain posture that meant a man's attention had drifted toward the parade of hats, rather than the shape of the world around him. If the mark felt a touch and frowned, the offending hand belonged, in an instant, to a friend who seemed eager to apologize, and in the exchange, the object that had caused the offense moved again. Now 3 bodies away. Theater, not force, carried the day. Violence spoiled business at the tracks. The crowd would stiffen. The police were more numerous, and the papers loved a brawl. So the blind beggar men practiced the soft arts and saved their boots for running, not for emphasis, like any crew that ventured west to work and east to sleep. They relied on a familiar economy to make their skills pay. A fence liked men whose goods were never hotter than they had to be, and who waited an hour after excitement to sell. Beer houses that served the poor law-abiding by day remembered to bolt their side doors and admit other commerce later, with a lamp turned down and talk kept soft. A good fence liked a regular, the prices were better, when a man brought in quality with a reputation for calm. In the well-run rooms, even the counting of coins had a silence to it, as though the money might cry out in the wrong hands. A few streets away in Shoreditch and Hoxton, a rougher name circulated Hoxton High Reps. If the blind beggar mob were artists of the light touch, the Hoxton lot were reputed to be the kind of men who put a blade in the picture before anyone asked for it. Their moniker borrowed glamour and dread from Liverpool's feared high-rip gang. The word high-ripping took on a life of its own in newspapers, a label that made any stabbing sound like a style. In practice, the Hoxton lads were much as crews elsewhere, young men with a taste for proving themselves, with tempers, with more courage after midnight than before, but their reputation ran ahead of them like a herald. If a passer-by was stripped and his face left bloodied, tongues wagged high-rip, whether or not the men involved had ever used the title for themselves. Police, fumbling through the fog of 1888 before a single murderer's shadow hardened into myth, did not overlook the Hoxton men as possible answers to crimes that looked, at first glance, like group work. A city already tense with the idea of gangs reached for a plural it knew, and a crew famous for knife play seemed to fit the fear as if made for it. That suspicion proved wrong for the murders that now bear one dreadful name, but it tells us what the street believed about Hoxton's fighters, that they stepped quickly to violence, that they made examples, that a man meet them in a narrow place did well not to look long. The day-to-day of the high rips was more ordinary and, in its way, uglier rushes at watch chains, robberies with a braggart's flourish, assaults born less of need than of the thickened blood that ale and numbers provide. Theirs was the psychology of turf sharpened to a point. Cross their market strip, and you were invited to a lesson, dispute a debt, and the payment might be collected in bone rather than coin. The very sound of their name, the way it dragged the newspaper fear from Liverpool to London, worked as a weapon. A shopkeeper who had read about high rippers was easier to tax. A witness who had heard of a high rip outrage in another city's paper thought twice before telling a magistrate what he'd seen at the corner. In Bethnal Green, the Green Gate gang took its name, as so many did, from a landmark known to the locals, likely a public house or a corner that tugged at memory. Their affairs were less theatrical than Hoxton's, and less traveled than the blind beggar men's. They worked their district as men work a garden methodically. Burglary and theft were their trades, and the lanes around their patch belonged to them after a certain hour. Windows that lacked shutters got a pry bar's kiss. A shop with a clerk known to step into the back room at predictable moments taught a patient lad when to slip a hand under a counter. The Greengate crew were neighborhood men, and neighborhood men rule by nothing so much as intimacy. They could name half the street by footstep. They could tell you which widow kept a dog and which kept a nephew. That knowledge made them bold and careful, by turns bold in the lane where they felt at home, careful where a stranger might notice their faces. If the blind beggar were migratory, the Green Gate were rooted, and Hoxton's high rips a storm front. Together, they sketched the variety of London's underworld. A single city gave birth to different styles because it offered different markets. In the West End, brevity was the soul of theft, lift, shift, vanish. In Hoxton's lanes, the threat of a knife wrote contracts more quickly than any lawyer could. In Bethnal Green, where shopkeepers slept 2 rooms from their goods, stealth mattered more than swagger. All could be the same boys in different moods. They could even overlap in membership when a cousin married across a border, when a lodger changed houses, when a man with a talent for one game tired of its risks and tried another. Names thickened habits into identities. The habits came first. The city furnished them with stages. Race days, as we've seen, were festivals of distraction. So were public holidays, when the West End glowed like a lantern and drew moths from the east. In those conditions, a well-practiced trio could lift more in an hour than a bricklayer could earn in a week, and walk home with their faces as straight as yardsticks. On ordinary nights, the Hoxton men watched corners where a watchman's round left a gap, where a constable's beat ran long, where a row of doors stood too close to the curb to allow a good swing of a truncheon. In Bethnal Green, burglary followed the grammar of routine: close the shop, count the till, take the pail to the yard, forget for 1 minute the latch that never quite catches, and in that 1 minute, a wrist as thin as a lath finds its way in and opens to an arm. Everywhere, the economics rhymed. Stolen goods had to move through the same small constellation of middlemen, the pawn, where a bit of silver could become meat. The backroom buyer who weighed risk against the gleam under a lamp. The woman who held items a day or two in a drawer with a secret false back, because she had learned that time itself cools a thing. The more violent crews took the worst prices. They could not afford to linger, but even the deft thieves accepted the margin as the cost of staying at liberty. What looked like sudden wealth became, under the numbers, simply a different wage paid for a different hazard. It ended, as wages do, in rent and bread and the unglamorous business of keeping boots mended. Now and then the city heard a smash and turned its head. A jeweler's window starred white. A hand darted in and out. A blur of men ran. A horse and cart that had looked like any other a moment before became a getaway. Such smash-and-grab theatrics belonged more famously to a later South London breed, but the idea that the speed and boldness could substitute for the stealth where glass and nerve were concerned circulated early as legend and threat both. The minor gangs learned from one another without holding meetings. A method that worked traveled faster than any sermon. Were these crews monsters? No, and nothing here varnishes them. They bruised, they frightened, they took. A pickpocket's art leaves a lighter mark than a knife, but a Victorian widow with a stolen purse still walks home with a heart pounding the same. A shopkeeper who pays a shilling for protection still pays this with a mouth dry as dust. Yet the very differences among the blind beggar lads, the Hoxton fighters, and the Green Gatemen remind us what the city was teaching in each lane. Where crowds gather, nimbleness rules. Where lanes tighten, menace sells. Where people sleep above their livelihoods, patience and timing unbar doors. Later storytellers bundled these names into a pageant of East End villainy, and perhaps that is inevitable. A city loves its legends, but in the register of the streets, these were working crews with local styles, successful not because the devil himself coached them, but because London, by its habits and hungers, had rehearsed them for years. They were part of the background music of the districts, quieter than the great scandals, louder than the honest labor that shared their pavements. You could avoid them one week and walk into them the next. You could admire, against your better self, the finesse with which they practiced the lift, or harden your jaw at the swagger with which they took a shilling that was not theirs. Either way, you learned their names, and as the decade turned, other names, louder and a stranger, waded across the river. Women in fine dresses with pockets deep enough to hide half a draper's counter, and men at the Elephant who would learn to turn fists into business. The newspapers liked their villains vivid and their geography foreign. Odessians, they wrote. Bessarabian tigers, names that prowled across headlines with the glamour of the exotic and the menace of teeth. A fight in a yard off Whitechapel Road became, in type, an incursion. A scuffle in a court near the Spitalfields Market became proof that the city harbored imported savagery. The labels did their work before the facts could put on a coat. Readers who had never walked the lanes felt they knew the boys who did, and the boys themselves, if they read at all, learned what they had been christened by men at desks miles away. Strip the paint, and the boards look familiar. In the 1880s and 90s, families fleeing restriction and violence on the continent found their way to the East End and took the rooms no one else would pay for. They brought with them trades of the hand, stitching, pressing, cutting, and plugged themselves into the East End's throbbing back rooms, where shirts and coats multiplied by lamplight. The sweater parceled work and collected his share. Piece rates rose and fell with the weather of demand. Boys carried bundles up and down stairs. Girls stitched linings until fingers went numb. Sabbats came, and lamps were turned down. Sabbats ended, and lamps were turned up. Around this lawful life, which was punishing enough, a fringe of trouble traced the same streets. It is here that the press's animals were supposed to prowl. There were crews, of course there were. Any district that pressed too many bodies into too little a space produced them. And any line that cut a neighborhood into us, and them sharpened their teeth. Young men with accents not yet worn down by London walked in clusters, because walking in clusters is how you cross another language and a hostile stare. A shout could turn to a shove, and a shove to a fight, with an awful quickness at the corner where a beer house emptied and a workshop closed. Sometimes the quarrel ran along old national seams. Irish boys and Jewish boys, each certain the other had undercut wages, each certain the other had looked too long at a sister on a doorstep. Sometimes it ran along the only line the streets truly respect turf. Our corner, your corner, and all the hard grammar that follows. The names the papers loved were not inventions out of whole cloth. Police did write of an Odessa gang, a shorthand as lazy as it was convenient for describing toughs, whose speech marked them as from somewhere east of the Prussian line. Bessarabian tigers, the phrase appears and reappears in columns that smelled of xenophobia, was a way to conjure a pack where a handful of lads would have been more accurate. These titles made for good copy because they performed a transformation. Boys became beasts. Street quarrels became invasions. They also gave Londoners a way to file their anxieties. Foreign roughs absorbed the blame for resentments born at home: rents too dear, wages too thin, the streets too dark, a city too swift to punish and too slow to help. Within the swirl of rumor, particular faces stood out. Isaac Darkey, Bogard, his nickname, a period Hitler that clings in the sources like a soot, appears in talk and report as a Jewish thief of some skill and some leadership. He headed a crew known in slang as the Goons, a name that would much later harden into other meanings, but then implied a certain swaggering, a youthfulness. Bogart was less a kingpin than a focal point, the sort of man to whom younger lads attached themselves because he knew the beer houses where a fence could be trusted, the streets where a constable's step slowed, the look that let a fight start and stop with minimal damage to one's own side. Around such figures, the neighborhood's protective instinct and predatory instinct intertwined, a crew that could answer a shouted insult with a quick, coherent show of force could also exploit the awe that show left behind a stalled text, a passerby discouraged, a watch lifted without much protest. The press's appetite for the lurid obscured the everyday reasons boys banded in foreign-accented groups. Self-defense was first, an insult outside a synagogue door after prayers, a shove given to a father whose shoulders bent under more than one weight, a shopkeeper who refused fair measure in a voice that carried these were as sparks in a dry season. Boys who had been taught at home to keep their heads down learned in the street that keeping one's head down and keeping one's face unbloodied were not always the same thing. And so a clique became a crew, a dozen cousins and not cousins who waited at the same corners, broke up the same fights in the same direction, and made sure that a lad who walked to the standpipe after dark did not walk alone. Predation followed where it always follows, slipping in the wake of solidarity. If your lot could keep others off a lane, it could also levy for the privilege of passing. If you could thrash a rival crew into minding its borders, you could also thrash a shopkeeper who decided to be brave about a shilling on a Thursday night. The work mirrored the wider East End. Some immigrant-labeled gangs preferred nimble theft market day pockets. Handkerchiefs pulled from a coat while a more volatile argument kept eyes up. Others discovered the satisfaction of a massed rush, the street's version of a cavalry charge over in seconds, messy, terrifying, profitable if a chain came loose and a purse broke free and nobody's nerve ran out too early. The newspapers added knives to every scene. The neighborhoods knew that threats, boots, and numbers usually sufficed. It is not that blades never flashed, they did, but that the city's nightly commerce of intimidation relied more on speed and noise than on blood, a splash of blood. After all, brought constables, and constables brought court, and court brought attention nobody wanted. Better to storm a little, bruise a little, and be gone with the money before the first whistle reached a second beat. The crews learned from their elders the promise of a knife worked nearly as well as the knife itself, and the promise left fewer marks you could not explain to a mother in the morning. Around the gangs moved quieter institutions that did not make the news. Mutual aid clubs gathered coins for burials and for weeks when work went thin, and the men who leaned close over those little tin boxes often spoke in the same accents as the boys who were frightening shopkeepers in the next street. Charity schools tried to keep sons at their desks until the sums, at least, were sound. A tailor who had prospered slightly might slip a loaf into another man's hands outside with as much secrecy as a thief used in passing a watch. The same community that produced a crew also produced the pressure to rein it in a mother who knew which older boy was setting the pace and told him so. A rabbi who called a couple of names from the bima with sorrow in his voice. An uncle who remembered a different city and did not want this one to learn the same lessons. Even so, scuffles regularly spilled into something bigger. It took almost nothing: a theater night, ale, a holiday crowd, a word that sounded different when pronounced from the back of the throat. Then the lanes became arenas. English-born lads who thought of themselves as guardians of an older street laid claim to a corner, and immigrant-born lads who had learned its stones as nursery ground by now laid claim to the same. Fists first, always a test. If the balance hung, boots, stones, the hasty reach for whatever lay close at hand. In these quarrels, the newspapers improved on the caste list Odessians versus English roughs, Bessarabians versus Irish navvies, and readers nodded because the story fit the map in their heads. Policemen wrote disorder, affray, assault. The courts wrote months and sometimes years. Mothers wrote prayers no one kept a record of because the labels were too sticky. Anything done by a boy with an accent could be filed under them. A pickpocket, operating with two friends along Whitechapel Road on a Saturday night, was suddenly an Odessian by virtue of a surname a clerk could not spell. A robbery with violence in a yard off Brick Lane by three boys called John, Tom, and Bill earned no zoological nickname at all. That asymmetry mattered. Stories accumulate like ash, and when the wind lifts, it drifts toward the same corners. The more often newspapers fed readers a bestiary of foreign gangs, the more likely those readers were to see, in every group of foreign-born lads, a threat that matched the headlines. The police, who dealt with the world as it was rather than as it appeared in woodcuts, suffered from the same skew. Suspicion saves time when time is always short. Yet for all the noise, most of the boys pressed into these headlines were doing what boys in these streets had always done, learning to be feared enough to be left alone. learning to turn that fear into a small income when they could, learning to hear a whistle half a lane away and decide, in a single step, whether to swagger or to scatter. If some crews boasted of being Odessians or Bessarabians, it was as much an answer to the names they had been thrown as it was a claim they felt in their bones. The street has always been quick to turn insult into banner, where the nickname with enough pride and it stops stinging. Shout it while you run, and it sounds like victory. Consider a Saturday night after sundown, when the Sabbath's quiet has given way to the ordinary London roar. Couples walk, a little freer, along the market streets. A policeman shifts his weight and stamps once in the cold. A cluster of boys lean where lantern light pools. Not quite on one side of the pavement or the other. A remark floats, innocent or not. A laugh answers. A body turns at a slant that invites reply. In the mouths of strangers watching from their windows, the fight will have a nation by morning. In the mouths of the lads who limp home with the split knuckles, it will have only places the corner by the rag shop, the yard with the bad latch, the court that always smells of onions and damp wool. The city is a map of such particulars. The headlines erase them. We do not deny that some of the worst nights wore foreign names. We note, instead, that the conditions that made those nights, the pressure of crowding, the arithmetic of wages and rent, the human urge to stand near your own when the world feels less than welcoming, were thoroughly local. Exoticized labels gave Londoners a grammar for their fears. The reality, as usual, spoke prose boys, streets, corners, nights, and the old work of turning a city's neglect into a brief advantage. From these immigrant-labeled crews we pass, soon, to a South Bank story that turned every expectation upside down. A gang of women whose manners were weapons and whose dresses were machines. If you wish to see the underworld work without the fog of legend, follow the small trades of crime as a social observer once did, notebook in hand and patience to match. The taxonomy he sketched was plain as a market bill: boys who dipped, men who fenced, women who diverted eyes, children who swarmed stalls, loungers who watched for the heavy-lidded stumble of gin. He wrote of bug hunters, a name that stuck because it sounded like pest control for men. These were the pub thieves who loitered in gin palaces and beer houses, waiting for intoxication to loosen buckles and judgment. They knew the hour when wages had been converted to drink, and hands forgot they were carrying them. One steadied a tipsy gentleman by the elbow, while another lifted what needed lifting. A third, respectable as a curate in his quiet, received the prize and drifted away before gratitude had finished being expressed. The hunt rarely required violence. LA did the softening, routine did the rest. Around such men clustered the pickpocket crews. Their choreography was tidy enough to be taught, though no one claimed to teach it. The stall did the looking and, when necessary, the blocking an accidental bump, a swerve into a path, a spilt cone of hot chestnuts that required profuse apology. The dip worked, the fingers, a handkerchief eased from a pocket, a purse nuzzled out by the pressure of a wrist, a watch chain divided by the briefest tug, and a knife so small it looked like an argument with the air. The stick man completed the circuit. He did not run. He did not even walk fast. He simply received and vanished in the ordinary traffic of the street, one more figure with his hat down. one more customer looking into a window, one more man lifting a pint at the bar as if he had been there all evening. When the alarm came, it came behind him. Women stood where men could not. At the counter, a decent dress and a hat set at the right angle were better than a cudgel. A girl inclined her head to admire the silk. A shopman leaned nearer than he should. Meanwhile, a small parcel moved across a border from honesty to commerce without leaving a ripple on the surface. Elsewhere, a woman with a baby could wait by a door and look like nothing at all until the moment came to accept a handoff under the shawl. Landladies, some hard as ship's nails, made their rooms the safest places in London for 2 hours if the rules were followed, and the coin laid out on the mantel shelf without argument. Female ingenuity also built the tools of the trade-pocketed skirts, padded muffs, bodices with seam pockets running like secret roads. Not every woman near a crime was an accomplice. Of course, most were simply living in the same thin economy as everyone else, but those who were in the game ran it with an efficiency their male partners acknowledged without flattery. The places where thieves and their auxiliaries did business were ordinary to the point of invisibility. Pawnshop's uncle, in the street's vocabulary, served the lawful poor by daylight, taking in Sunday suits on Monday mornings and returning them for a fee on Saturdays. After hours, by understanding rather than by advertisement. The same counter might convert a sliver of silver into rent without many questions about provenance. The ticket that uncle handed across a little rectangle of hope could itself be sold, bought, or held against the future. Beer houses acted as employment bureaus. A man who needed a hand for something entirely respectable could find one. A man who needed a hand for something else could also find one. Doss houses were both dormitory and bulletin board. Between coughs and snores, names were passed and reputations weighed. He's quick, he's unlucky, he drinks when there's coin, he keeps his mouth assessments were as brief and as consequential as any in a counting house. Children worked because children were there. Packs of them learned the market's weak points as naturally as they learned the cracks in the pavement. A barrow piled high with apples presented temptation and training. 2 boys jostled and laughed. A third slipped a dozen into a cap. A fourth kept lookout for a constable who knew their faces by age, if not yet by name. In linen shops, little hands untied neat stacks and retied them looser to hide the absence of a sheet. Near gin palaces, a boy half a head shorter than the counter tapped a drunk on the coat and asked a question that had no answer. While the man fumbled for words, a friend made free with the unbuttoned pocket. Adults tutted and said children were not what they had been. They were exactly what the streets had made them. The economy of stolen goods had its own price lists, unwritten and widely understood. A silver watch brought more than a brass one. A good purse fetched less if it was still warm from a pocket. Books were slow to move and went cheaply unless they could be cut for plates. Clothes, if of quality, found their way to shops that specialized in nearly new. Jewelry demanded patience. Move it too fast and you invited attention. Hold it too long and you risked it being found at your house. The wise turned the risk into distance 3 hands between the taker and the seller. A day's delay before any transaction. A sale made in a different parish under the eye of a buyer who had no love for talkers. Money in such rooms didn't clink, it whispered. Retaliation maintained order more effectively than written law in many lanes. The code was simple and unsentimental. Informers did not live comfortably. A witness who stared too hard in court found his shutters marked, or his windows starred one night with pebbles wrapped in a warning. Shopkeepers who stood up to a demand for beer money saw their signs defaced, their doors kicked, their trade reduced by the news that their lane had become unfriendly to boys with long memories. Violence at this scale was not theatrical. It was punctuation, one broken pane, one bruised face, one cart turned over in the morning as if by accident. The message got through. Testifying was a luxury few felt they could afford. The phrase "as much as his life was worth" entered ordinary talk, heavy as a coin in the mouth. Within a crew, discipline looked like family life turned inside out. Loyalty ran on the same channels as blood brothers watched each other's backs. Cousins made excellent lookouts. A man's sister might carry a parcel because she was the one person he trusted not to open it. Leadership was a matter of nerve and timing. A fellow who could read a street faster than the rest, who knew when to call something off and when to push through panic-collected deference without having to ask for it. Shares were sometimes formal halves, quarters, eighths, depending on the risk taken and sometimes settled by unspoken custom. The stickman got less than the dip. The stall got something for his trouble. The fence took what the market demanded. And the landlord levied his own silent tax every time he kept the shutter from seeing what it might have seen. There was also a strategy, such as it was. Crews learned to vary routes and to break habits the moment a constable's gaze began to fall too predictably on a certain corner. They changed beer houses for a fortnight and then returned cautiously, as if the furniture had memories. They dressed down when heat came on and dressed up when it cooled. A lad who had achieved a recognizable swagger learned the surprising value of a stoop. On race days, trios arrived separately and left the same way. On theater nights, one man stood 2 streets off to watch for the peculiar hurry of police who themselves had learned to run rather than to walk when something was afoot. Some work involved patience rather than daring. Burglars studied the cadence of a shopkeeper's evening. The till counted twice. The latch on the back gate that never quite caught. The moment when a bucket was carried out and the door left swinging. A wrist bone could slide past a tongue of wood. A thin child could be lifted through a fanlight. A simple wedge could keep a door from ever settling. The way a fingertip holds a page in a book while a reader looks up. The best nights yielded nothing more dramatic than a quiet drawer emptied and a door drawn firm behind the departing. The worst yielded the rush of a shout too soon, and a flight over roofs that left the man's breath like fire, and his foot bloodied without his knowing how. Not every method scaled to profit. Most of what the street devised paid in small coin, and in the satisfaction of not being a fool in one's own neighborhood. A watch was a week's bread. A bundle of handkerchiefs was rent grudgingly met. A shilling of protection collected by the same pair of boots for 4 Thursdays in a row could keep a bar quiet and a name bright with a certain sort of fame. In such arithmetic, the gang's reason for being explained itself. It multiplied advantage and divided risk. It offered a boy's significance in the language the street spoke, the nod of men at a beer house door, the stepping aside of rivals in a narrow lane, the blessing of a landlady who kept his secrets because he kept her rules. The law, when it entered this economy, did so episodically with a hand on a shoulder in a crowd, with a whistle, with a truncheon brought down in a way that told as much as it hurt. Magistrates, reading a parade of small offenses that looked much larger when strung together, hardened their sentences. Robbery with violence earned the lash as well as the term. Repeaters found themselves counted differently. The street adjusted. Boys learned to run earlier. Men learned to carry little that could be used as evidence. Fences set stricter terms or moved rooms. Witnesses who might have spoken decided that the silent tongue is safest. Under pressure, the habits did not vanish. They refined, and beneath the refinements sat the same human ground. A lodging house full to the rafters, a pair of boots whose soles were more hope than leather, a stomach that asked its question with a regularity the city could not meet by honest means. The observer's categories: bug hunters, dips, stickmen. Fences help us see the moving parts, but the motor remains as before: overcrowding, dark corners, low wages, and the old ordinary desire to be safer in a group than out of it. In the next movement of our story, the city grips back. A handful of cases, much publicized, become levers. The courts find their stride, sentences lengthen and grow exemplary. The threshold between swagger and servitude narrows. The night takes notice. By the late 80s, the city had learned the gang's steps, and the gang had learned the city's. Each knew the other's habits too well. Then, in a handful of cases, the pattern stumbled, and London seized the chance to change the time. Newspapers called it a reckoning. Policemen called it a reprieve. Magistrates called it a duty long deferred. Whatever the word, the street began to feel a new kind of pressure, not the old rattle of a watchman's pole, but a heavier hand stayed once it landed. The mood coalesced around episodes that would have been, in other years, merely the latest outrage. In the spring and summer of 1888, with nerves already frayed in the East, a murder near Regent's Park turned an ordinary fear into a demand. A night of roving mischief ale, insults tossed like stones. The swagger that comes of numbers ended with a man down and the city wide awake. The men taken up were the usual sort of hard fellows, the kind who knew South London corners where even a constable looked twice before following. Nothing was novel in their faces. The novelty lay in the noise that followed. Editors thundered. Respectable men in parlors shook their heads and said the courts must make examples. What passed for impunity began to look, to those with power, like an embarrassment. Across the country, another theater had staged the same drama and already found its second act. Liverpool's high-rip men, so often borrowed as a headline in London, had lately been met with sentences that could be measured in years rather than months. The lash, that old answer revived during the garroting scare, reappeared in judgment for robbery with violence. Articles that compared London unfavorably with Liverpool landed like goads if Merseyside could scotch its high rippers with penal servitude and cat. Why should the capital let its own crews strut The public loves a prescription, and the bench, eager to be seen as curative, reached for the same bottle. Court became a stage where the city rehearsed its new resolve. Imagine, for a moment, a morning in one of the police courts when the case that has set tongues wagging at beerhouse counters comes up at last. The gallery is thick with elbows. Reporters lean forward so far their pencils shadow the dock. The accused appear boys, really, but boys dressed in the uniform the city has taught it hates caps set at an angle, boots that creak with a remembered swagger, faces too blank or too bright. The sergeant, tidy as a ledger, reads a list of associates in a tone that asks no questions. A constable describes the chase as though it were instruction on a blackboard. A witness stares at his own hat brim and keeps his voice low, unwilling to look at the faces in the dock or the ones behind him. The magistrate speaks the phrase that carries a shiver even to those who came to gloat robbery with violence. The bench confers, and when the sentence falls, it does not stop at prison with hard labor to receive 15 strokes. No one mistakes the meaning. The law, which had so often felt like a breeze, has decided to be whether hard labor in the mouths of the respectable sounded almost wholesome, like exercise for errant youth. Inside the walls, it had other names, oakum-picking old rope teased into fibers until the tar sat in a man's nails and would not wash, turned hours into grit. The crank and iron handle a prisoner turned to no purpose, but discipline counted revolutions in silence and punished idleness with more of the same. The treadmill taught a man how long a minute can be when it is chained to another. In some prisons, the work was real enough. Stone quarried, roads broken, shot drill done under the eye of men who counted slowly when they were kind and quickly when they were not. But in every case, the lesson the sentence wished to teach was monotony. Swagger does not flourish under routines that grind. The cat o' nine tails, reserved in theory for the worst offenses, existed in the imagination beyond its statistical use. Its crack traveled farther than any constable's whistle. Parents invoked it, editors praised it, even men who had never felt it spoke of it with a mixture of fear and bravado, as though to deny its sting were a way to boast of one's own hardness. Judges, reminded of the 70s remedies for the garroter, found the old language surprising easy in the mouth, a salutary example, they said, and no one in the pit corrected the grammar. Pressure did not come only from pulpits and papers, it also came from ledgers. Merchants who had suffered high-ripping theatrics in one city wrote to friends in another and asked why London tolerated what Liverpool had thrashed. Racecourse proprietors, tired of pickpocket seasons that correlated too neatly with their calendars, discovered the convenience of moral outrage when it aligned with their takings. The Metropolitan Police, stung by criticisms both fair and glib, were glad of any case that allowed them to show grip. Arrests followed not only for the night's deed, but for anything that could be made to attach to the name vagrancy, drunkenness, supervision breaches under earlier statutes. The tangle of small offenses that, braided together, looked like a rope fit for tying up the worst, for the street. The change felt at first like weather, not law and eddy of bad luck a crew might ride out with quieter habits and sorer knuckles. Then the pattern held, men who had expected on a second or third appearance. The usual months found years instead. Lads who had boasted about a fight in a lane began to learn the new arithmetic of being kept from gin and girls for longer than a season. Doss house keepers listened behind their doors and heard the hush grow deep. Beer house landlord practiced selective amnesia when constables asked who had been in 2 nights ago. Fences got cautious and then the scarcer. None of this ended the gangs. It tightened the cord around their throats. The press applauded, mostly. One paper famously remarked that nothing had done more to a Scotch, if not kill the worst of the northern crews, than heavy terms with hard labor. Let London take note. The tone was half sermon, half a sports commentary, an odd blend, but one that suited the moment. Each long sentence was treated as a victory in a match. The public did not quite understand, but was certain it wished to see one. That is the nature of panics translated into policy. They recalibrate expectation. A magistrate who might have hesitated last year now could be confident that the pit would cheer. A few voices worried aloud about excess. They pointed out, not unreasonably, that the same newspapers that had delighted in exaggerating gangs into armies now sang doom songs over the souls of boys who would come out of prison harder than they had gone in. But these objections were quieter than the editorial thunder, and while they may have traced true lines into the future, they could not compete with a story in which a city finally showed its teeth. For men and women who had paid shillings for beer money under duress, who had watched sons limp home bloodied from a corner, they had every right to cross. The sudden vigor of the courts felt like justice, even if it also felt like relief, only rented for a time. At the margins, policing itself changed shape. Beats were adjusted. Plainclothes work grew more common. The attention given to known associates became, in practice, a net that snagged some men before their deeds could be proved. Lists mattered. To be written down in a sergeant's book as known to Hoxton lot or frequent's blind beggar was to carry a shadow you could not shake off easily. The prevention statutes of earlier years, with their provisions for supervision and reporting, were applied with fresh appetite. A man who had thought himself clever enough to dance along the edge discovered the edge had moved. Even so, the change was not uniform. The East remained a web of lanes with more exits than the law had boots to guard. Courage remained variable. Corruption whispered where poverty pressed men's ethics thin. There were magistrates lenient by temperament or by calculation, and nights when the old pattern returned as easily as a hand to a pocket. But by the 1890s, the balance had shifted enough for the street to feel it. The era of easy swagger of the belief that numbers and noise could fend off consequences was ending. The city had learned to answer in plurals, arrests, statutes, sentences. Gangs survived, but they did so with tighter lips, shorter circuits, and a new respect for the clock and the calendar. In that atmosphere, reputation itself changed value. A crew that once traded on its name found the name now brought heat too quickly. Boys who had shouted their titles under certain windows learned to keep their pride inside their teeth. The cleverest adapted by narrowing their work, choosing quieter trades, swapping force for finesse. Others, built for display, broke themselves on the new hardness of the courts and disappeared into years the streets forgot to count. Mothers counted, so did landladies, who looked at a bunk and found it empty longer. What remains, looking back, is not a triumphal march, but a hinge. The prosecutions of the late 80s, the sentences that followed, the public's appetite for remedy all turned the city's key a notch. The gangs did not vanish, they altered. The loudest roughs either learned to whisper or learned to live inside walls. The shrewder thieves trimmed their risks to suit the mood. And over the river, in a district with a junction for a name, an unusual syndicate thrived precisely because it had already mastered what the moment required: discipline, quiet methods, and a genius for working inside the blind spots of respectability. Before the bench grew fond of examples, they had learned to be exceptions. They wore fine dresses and carried rooms in their skirts. They were called the 40 Elephants, and they were waiting. Cross the bridges to South London, and you meet a paradox in petticoats. The lanes around the Elephant and Castle Junction markets, horse traffic, a clatter of cheap lodging houses gave their name to an outfit that upset every expectation the city cherished about crime and gender. They were called the 40 Elephants, sometimes the 40 Thieves by a public eager for a fairy tale title. And they were women who turned the manners of respectable shopping into a set of lockpicks. Where the men of the East End relied on boots, blades, or nimble fingers, the Elephants carried rooms in their skirts and silence in their smiles. Their genius lay in understanding that London had built itself a stage for them. The new emporiums along counters piled with folded calicos and velvets, drapers who prided themselves on courtesy, floor walkers who bowed, were designed to flatter a lady's sense of herself. In those aisles, suspicion felt like bad manners. A well-dressed girl at a counter could ask to see a bolt of silk, then another, then a third, while her companion admired the first. The shopman, anxious to serve elegantly, leaned in and turned his head at the right moment. Between a cough and a compliment, a package the size of a prayer book slipped into the geography of a skirt, false hems, bagged petticoats, secret seams tucked where no gentleman would ever think to look, and many a shopman dared not. Etiquette itself became an accomplice. A male assistant who suspected a theft still hesitated to insist on a search that would force his hands anywhere near a lady's person. By the time a matron could be fetched, the goods had been transferred to a muff, a cape, or more cunning, still handed off to a friend who was already expressing indignant innocence near the door. They rehearsed in beer-house back rooms and parlors. They performed in Liberties and Harrods, at drapers, large and the small, in arcades where light fell prettily on stones, and in provincial towns when London grew nosy. Their dress was equipment bodices with stitched pockets, voluminous skirts, fat with secret chambers, muffs that swallowed handkerchiefs, gloves, even a small box of jewels, and hats with crowning space where pins did double duty as fastenings and, if cornered, as weapons. The trick was not to look like a thief, but like a lady certain of service. A woman who complained in the correct tone, offended, tired, above inconvenience, could turn a floor walker into her advocate in under a minute. A touch of faintness could bring a chair, a glass of water, and an absence of attention to the handoff happening half a yard away. They were not freelancers drifting in parallel. Under Mary Carr, born in the 1860s, handsome of face and iron of will, they became a discipline. She gathered, what had been a sisterhood of shoplifters into an organization with memory and rules. A proper chain of command that the police, when they finally said the words in court, called a queen and her followers. There was a hierarchy: Mary at the top, lieutenants below, recruits beneath them, learning the craft one careful afternoon at a time. There were regulations about shares and behavior: no drunken displays, no private fencing, no boasting in rooms where the walls might listen. Discretion was revenue. Loyalty was enforced not with romance, but with the plain arithmetic of fear and favor. A woman who kept faith could count on the gang's protection. A woman who thought herself cleverer than the rules might find business impossible on the streets where the elephant's good opinion mattered. Their methods varied by shop. Sometimes 3 or 4 entered together, each with a part. One charmed the assistant, trying on gloves or asking for lace, while discussing whether her aunt's complexion could bear a warmer shade. One accidentally overturned a box of ribbons so that white hands fluttered about in showy apology. Another drifted far enough down the counter to be plausibly apart, where an item could be tested against the light, appreciated, and vanished into a seam with a courtesy that looked like the adjustment of a skirt. If a suspicion flared, the most composed of them grew indignant. "Do you dare?" she said, with a lady's chill, and the manager, chivalrous, cautious, a little afraid of his own embarrassment, soothed, apologized, discounted. Meanwhile, the goods had already changed hands, twice perhaps, and were gone. Department stores were not their only pasture. Service offered other doors. With forged references and the right manner, a young woman could enter a house as a maid-of-all-work or a parlor maid for a day or a week, long enough to learn the locks, rhythms, hiding places for jewels, and the whereabouts of the mistress's keys. In the first quiet hour after the family left for a dinner or the theater, the elephant's ally inside could unlock a drawer, pass what she found through a scullery door, and resign with tears the next morning over a sick mother counties away. Hotels were friendlier still. A woman with the appearance of means could step past porters without question, linger along a corridor with a maid's confidence, and test a door she had seen carelessly closed behind a gentleman. Mary herself was said to prefer jewels, an art that required nerve and a talent for reading, who was likely to complain most softly when the loss was discovered. If theft is a harvest, fencing is the mill. Here the elephants were more modern than many male gangs. They cultivated a chain of buyers across the city. Honest men turned middlemen by degrees. Shopkeepers with a second till. Off-the-books traders whose premises were so dull by daylight no one would ever suspect the nightlife. The women delivered goods cooled by time and distance, never hot from a counter unless necessity had bid them be rash. A bolt of silk became dress links before it was sold. A piece of jewelry was broken into parts. Gloves and ribbons were dispersed between shops where the sight of new stock would not raise an eyebrow. They thought in the supply lines. London taught them to. Their authority did not end at the counter. In time, during their Victorian and Edwardian arc, they demanded a tax from freelances who worked their shops. Pay the elephants their due, or find yourself jostled, exposed, or worse. It was not delicate. Discipline within could be as hard as any male gang's spoils docked. a public rebuke in a room where it stung, a rougher correction if a woman's indiscretion had brought the police through a door they otherwise would have left alone. Stories clung to the gang like perfume, one member brandishing a hatpin with unsentimental accuracy when cornered, a rival warned off with a thrashing that left no marks where a respectable doctor would look first. For all their skills, the elephants understood the power of appearing to belong. That required a study. They learned the West End's dress codes and mirror-polished themselves to wear them. The difference between a governess's black and a lady's simple day dress is a language. They spoke it. They learned how to move through doors without calling a porter's eye and how to end a conversation with a floor walker so that he felt he had been complimented. They knew when to be seen and when to be invisible, how to adopt the slight impatience of a provincial gentlewoman in town for a season, or the serene authority of a patroness who has shopped at this counter since before the assistant was born. If a storm blew, if a manager insisted, if a search seemed certain, they could collapse into affront, tears trembling on lashes, and demand the presence of a female searcher, buying the moments their confederate needed to clear the building. The police learned the pattern more as slowly than the shops did, in part because the pattern mocked their assumptions. The underworld's caricature wore trousers and kept late hours outside gin palaces. The elephants slept at sensible times and took their gin, if they took it at all, out of sight. A woman in a good coat was not a picture the average constable had been trained to read as danger. When at last the law pronounced the words aloud, the queen of the 40 thieves, it did so with a mixture of scandal and fascination. In court, detectives testified that nothing significant happened without Mary's word. The newspapers played willing chorus, crowning a villainess with adjectives that said as much about Victorian discomfort with female agency as they did about crime. Heat rose, as it must when a story gains headlines. The elephants thinned their presence in certain rooms, sent younger women to test counters, while older hands sat a season out and traveled more often beyond London, where provincial shops had manners without the practice that made London wary. When things cooled, they returned, because the city had not cured itself of the habits that made them possible. Its shops still prized propriety over suspicion. Its managers still flattered appearances. Its staff still deferred to the right voice. The elephants, polite as knives, were there to profit from that deference. What makes their tale more than a curiosity is not merely that they were women in a man's trade, but that they professionalized theft with a clarity that put many male crews to shame. They kept hours, they kept books of a sort, shares agreed and remembered, they enforced standards and punished sloppiness, and they understood logistics. In a world that excused certain kinds of ladylike transgression as nerves in the wealthy while flogging poor boys for a stolen chain, they inverted the terms. They wore the costume of respectability as armor and turned every after you, madam, into a tiny advantage. It would be neat and false to claim they robbed only the rich. Department stores supplied half the city, provincial shops supplied the rest, and a stolen bolt of silk still meant a draper's wife fretted over accounts. The harm was real, the losses keenly felt. but the historical interest lies in their method and its mirror. London had layered itself with rituals designed to keep its classes in order. The 40 elephants learned those rituals as fluently as any duchess and used them to lift without noise. When the city looked for brigands, it searched alleys and beer houses. It did not expect, not truly, to find a gang at a counter being shown lace. From here, their story runs forward into trials and scandals that put names in the print and a queen in the dock, and sideways into an alliance with the men who worked the same South London streets with fists and wagers. But before we turn to the elephant and castle mob, their brothers in method, if not in gender, hold the image of these women steady dresses engineered like toolboxes, muffs with secrets, calm faces that turned a shop courtesy into a key. In a city that made respectability a theater, they learned the lines and stole the props. The year the 40 elephants stepped from whisper to headline, London discovered that a gang could be both familiar and shocking if it wore the wrong clothes. The trouble began with two scandals that bled into one another in column after column. The abduction of a toddler, Michael McGee, whose name, spoken in court, put a child's cry into the machinery of crime, and the ambush of a female rival, Nelia Stanley, punished for working where the elephants considered the ground already tithed. These were not the quiet triumphs in lace and gloves that had kept the women in profit for a decade. They were noisy, human, messy. They drew detectives into parlors and made editors lick their pencils. By 1895, the gang Mary Carr had welded into discipline could no longer hide in the city's blind spots. With a child and a battered woman as exhibits, the public's moral theater demanded principles, not chorus. Mary, who had disdained the stage, found herself on it. Courtrooms, always ready to become playhouses, obliged. In the dock, the elephants looked like any row of respectable women forced to suffer impertinence. In the well, Scotland Yard men finally said aloud what they had muttered for years. The prisoner, one detective testified, is known as the Queen of the 40 Thieves. The phrase pleased the papers. It flattered the appetite for Paradox's villainous Queen, Thieves, and it turned a disciplined enterprise into a story with a crown at the top. There were particulars, to days and places, counters and corridors, the names of shops, the names of buyers, the moments when politeness had been turned like a blade against its owner. In the kidnapping case, the narrative that arrived for the public was lurid and simple. A child snatched to lever, an adult quarrel ransom, revenge, a custody spite dressed in melodrama. In the assault on Nellie Stanley, the plot was older than London territory. Fees. The rough tax a power exacts from the small trader who forgets to tip his hat. It did not matter that the facts were fussier, or that proof, in some corners, depended on the elastic threads that bind neighborhood talk to sworn word. The bench heard enough. The press heard more. Mary Carr played her part without theatrics, which is its own kind of theater, handsome and controlled. She stood against a picture the era preferred for women who aired the trembling possessor of nerves, to estray in need of correction, reporters intoxicated by the same paradox that had set them sharpening pencils, improved on the truth with adjectives. One called her the worst woman in London, a line that told you less about Mary than about the city's unease at female command. The elephants had inverted a social ritual. The court inverted the gang's quiet. Sentence followed jail in 1896, and the crown the press had placed on Mary's head served now to make her removal feel like an emblem. The Queen was in jail. The city could imagine its counters safe again. But the gang was never just a head. It was a spine. While Mary served her time, a Lieutenant Minnie Dugan kept the body upright. She tightened rules, rationed risk, trimmed the roster at the counters where heat still shimmered from the trials. Fences were cherry, beer house backrooms cooled, provincial excursions multiplied while London gossiped itself out. Within the sisterhood, discipline grew brisk. No one wanted another sensational case. A woman who might once have swaggered after a good lift learned to carry her success as if it were groceries. If a recruit fell in love with her own nerve, older hands reminded her without poetry what had happened to the Queen. And yet, the machine did not stall. Silk still vanished, gloves still walked, a jewel still broke into smaller jewels. In rooms where no constable could see, shares were counted with the same tidy arithmetic as before, risk rewarded, discretion praised, fines levied for sloppiness, silence kept. Prison is a school with an ugly curriculum. Mary learned what all long-sentenced offenders learn: the tyranny of hours, the mutiny of the body against monotony, the way a sentence repeats itself inside your head until it becomes a second name. In due course, she returned to South London older, quieter, no less commanding for having learned how quickly the stage can be cleared. Accounts agree that she resumed the reins no proclamation, simply the old attention to order. The gang's survival depended on reining in exactly the impulses that had made it famous. Appear in the right rooms less often, vary faces, cool goods longer, and force tribute from independent women with a whisper instead of a blow, unless a blow was necessary, and if it was necessary, administer it in the places of the body that would not call a doctor. An anecdote from these years ran like a warning through the beer houses. A member, cornered, had sent a hatpin into a policeman's eye and left him half blind. Whether the story was embroidered hardly mattered. It reminded the city that the weapon of ladylike crime was not always costume alone. Uniqueness sharpened the gaze turned on them. The 40 elephants were not the only women thieves in London. That would be absurd, but they were the only all-female gang with a structure that made detectives speak of ranks without smirking. That fact pricked two nerves at once. It affronted a gender script that imagined womanhood as a soft moral influence on the male astray, and it embarrassed the complacent fiction that organized crime meant men in caps around a table with mugs. The women's success laid bare the city's own complicity. Stores had built a courtesy so rigid that it could be gamed. Managers had taught their staff to defer to a certain kind of voice. The law had drilled its officers to expect danger from the wrong silhouettes. The elephants had simply studied the syllabus better than their examiners. Meanwhile, the alliance with the elephant and Castleman neighbors, sweethearts, occasional partners, mattered as buffer and bridge. The women did not need male muscle to work a counter, but muscle is a useful language in certain disputes. In return, the men, who made their living more often with fists, wagers, and overt menace, admired the women's logistics and enjoyed the cooling effect their discipline had on rooms that might otherwise run hot. On a smash-and-grab night years later, a woman of the elephants would even drive a getaway car, a neat inversion of any cliché a penny dreadful might have offered. The lines between crews were never as clean as the papers drew them. Affection, geography, and profit tied knots in the thread. Press attention, like any weather, passes. With Mary out and the scandal season over, the elephants settled to a lower hum. The 1890s taper into the new century. The gang's Victorian chapter thins, but the line does not break. It thickens elsewhere. In 1915, a young woman with a name like a headline, Alice Diamond, Diamond Annie to friends and enemies, took the chair Mary had warmed and ran the enterprise with a public audacity suited to a noisier age. Under Diamond Annie, the elephants would become notorious in a way that made the older, subtler thefts look almost delicate by comparison as smash and grabs, society jewel raids, a press that adored its own reflection. That future belongs to another chapter. What matters here is the continuity. The habits Mary imposed hierarchy, ruled, share, silence survived her absence and her return. The gang did not merely endure, it professionalized further. Victorian London tried to make sense of them by making them moral. Some writers tutted about the fall of womanhood. Others, thrilled by the novelty of female audacity, gilded Mary with melodrama until she looked like a character from a sensation novel. Neither portrait serves. The gang's interest was not in symbol, but in method. It took what the city offered, propriety, deference, blind spots, and turned them to account. It recruited not from some imagined Amazonian reserve, but from the same streets that furnished male gangs' daughters who needed rent, sisters whose brothers were already in the life, wives who discovered they had a gift for calm under pressure that no ironing board could reward. Their daring was not theatrical, it was procedural, and the harm it matters, and it should be named. A draper on the margin does not shrug off a vanished bolt of silk. A jeweler whose stock walks out in a muff sits up at night, adding columns and wondering which mouth will go unfed. The 40 elephants did not right social wrongs by selecting only the wealthy as their marks. They stole where theft was possible, and for the same reasons thieves always cite when the door closes rent. Hunger, fear, pride, the pleasure of success at a dangerous craft. The pathos sits with victims and offenders, both because the city that made the opportunity also made the need. What the scandals of 1895 and 96 changed was not only the gang's routine, but London's idea of its own underworld. The queen of the 40 thieves and the picture of a child carried off gave the press two icons it could print forever. The assault on arrival gave reformers ground to argue that even among thieves, women were not safe from women. The law answered with iron. The gang answered with quiet. When the century turned, the names on the charge sheets altered, but the method endured. The women had shown that a criminal syndicate could be as neatly run as any shop. The city, chastened, learned a little, unlearned less. Across the junction, their allies, men whose story we have skirted, were gathering toward a different kind of fame. They would make their money at tracks and rings, in pubs and parlors, and their line would run forward into a modern London of cars and cameras. For now, fix the picture of Mary Carr, a woman who refused to play the role assigned her, who built a crew out of caution and cunning, who went to prison under a label that revealed more about the labelers than about her, and who returned to find that her method had taken root. The 40 elephants, by then, were an institution. The city would contend with them and with the men of the Elephant and Castle in the years ahead. The lanes had new rulers, and they wore whatever costume the moment required. Across the river from Whitechapel's lanes, the Elephant and Castle Junction threw out roads like spokes, each one delivering trade, gossip, and opportunity. Markets jostled with horse traffic. Cheap lodging houses breathed in and out with the day. Pubs ran hot with wagers. Out of this crossroads grew the Elephant and Castle mob men, whose business was less sleight of hand than presence, less the delicate lift than the blunt assertion that a corner, a ring, a race course, a cart road belonged to them if they could keep it. If the 40 elephants turned etiquette into a tool, their neighbors in caps used weight of fist, of number, of nerve. Geography was their first advantage. The junction bridged city and south, cabs rattling to and fro, carts piled with goods bound for the suburbs or the river roads. A crew that held the pubs nearest the meeting of ways controlled introductions, watched strangers arrive, and caught wind of who would be moving what at dusk. The Elephant's beer houses did more than sell ale. They hosted wagers, arranged mills in back rooms, and a stored rumor, prize fighting, illegal but adored, stitched the subculture together. A back room might be cleared with 2 minutes notice benches scraped back, a circle made, shirts off, boots set aside, money gathered in fists. A man who kept order at such moments, who quieted the bravest fool, who paid out without shaving a coin, who decided when a referee's glance would become a nod, earned a title the street respected governor. On such nights, the room felt like its own republic. Smoke frilled the lamps. A fiddler sawed at a single tune as if it could keep time itself. A fighter's cornerman dabbed vinegar on grazed skin and murmured sense into hot blood. Outside, a lad leaned at the door, eyes on the road for a certain policeman or a certain rival. Inside, bets shifted like tides. Between rounds, messages were exchanged as naturally as tankards, who owed what, who had insulted whom, who would need protection at a stall tomorrow. Muscle and money met here, and the men who could have marshaled both found themselves at the head of a crew, whether or not they had ever asked to lead. The elephant mob's rackets matched their stages. Protection was the simplest business. Pubs that kept late hours and betting books. Barrow pitches in good spots on market days. Bookmakers at race meetings who did not want a rush to spoil the afternoon. A shilling bought peace where the mob decided peace was saleable. Gambling gave them reach. They knew the men who ran illicit card rooms and dice games. They knew the fixes that could fatten a purse threatening a jockey with a reminder that a fall can look like an accident. Persuading a prize fighter that he had suddenly remembered his mother's counsel about pride. Fraud, too, paid when the luck of a law and circumstance aligned, a shipment diverted, a counterfeit note passed with a grin and a toast, and when a stealth was poor value, speed took its place. The smash and grab glass starred, a hand like lightning, a blur of boots into the dark made a jeweler's insurance clerk wince. A horse-drawn dray leaving the city with cargo tempting enough could find itself stuck up beyond the lamps, 2 men at the heads of the horses, a third at tailboard, a few minutes' work, and then only the hoofbeat echoing back toward the elephant as if it had never slowed. If the women across the way were an organization with minutes in their heads, the men were a federation of habits that hardened into method. Leadership changed with temper and time. One name that the streets muttered when the century was in its last decades was Alf Gorman, quick with his fists, quicker with his judgments, and linked to Mary Carr by more than geography. Their partnership, romance, or alliance, the street rarely afforded the luxury of distinguishing, was a knot that tied the two crews closer. The men admired the women's discipline and intelligence networks. The women valued the men's readiness to speak the language of force when a rival needed dissuading. Together they made the district feel as if it were held in a single deft hand. South London did not lack for rivals, but in the Victorian years, the elephant mob kept a lower newspaper profile than the East End's named terrors. Their reputation circulated by word of mouth, not woodcut. That suited them, and it suited the police, who preferred their problems to be local and manageable. Yet when the city's nerves sang in 1888, even South London's swagger fed the choir. After the night near Regent's Park, when Joseph Rumbold was murdered, youths roving, bravado set to a knife's key papers thundered that London, like Liverpool, had high rippers, and demanded to know what the bench would do about it. George Gatley, one of the South London group, went down for the killing, and the editorial appetite for examples grew fat. Lists of gangs spilled from columns Fitzroy Square, Marylebone Road, a set in 7 Dials called the Decker's Proof, if any were needed, that London had its own menaces beyond the East. The elephant crowd was not named that day. They did not need to be to feel the weather change. Outcry aligned with interest. Racecoursemen wanted the pickpockets thinned. Shopkeepers wanted fewer smashed windows. The police wanted a chance to prove that beats. Plainclothes work and courts could keep a lid on what had begun to look to Parliament like a national embarrassment. Sentences lengthened, and the south of the river lads learned the new arithmetic as swiftly as their East End counterparts. It made a difference at the margins, fewer boastful marches down the high road after closing, more caution in picking quarrels, a new habit of doing business with the door shut and a trusted boy at the hinge. Even with pressure up, the elephant's position at the crossroads made growth feel natural. Everything passed their door money in wagers and purses. Men with shoulders fit for jobs that needed 2 hands and no conscience. News, which is a currency the clever can spend twice. They leveraged it all. If a bookmaker at the track needed guarding from a mob with other loyalties, the elephant could supply it at a price. If a draper in Southwark sought quiet evenings after weeks of boys testing his nerve, a quiet word in a certain ear bought him peace, at least until someone offered the same ear a better price. If a fight needed arranging, the gang acted as promoter and arbiter, taking a cut large enough to feel like honor and small enough to pass as fair. Rumors, like fog, gather thickest where the ground is uneven. Talk in the 1890s hinted that a constable or 2 in South London chose not to see certain doors at certain hours, or to walk a beat that curved kindly around a particular pub. Poverty writes corruptions into the margins of any system. A small regular coin can make a hard job feel softer. There is no need to embroider. The pattern is as old as law itself. The elephant men, who understood what human nature would sell, bought its services sparingly. A policeman who is bought crudely becomes dangerous to everyone, buyer included. Better to trade in favors and understandings. He's quiet this month. Leave that house. It has friends, than to parade a leash in public. It is tempting, reading the years forward, to see in the elephant and castle mob the outline of a later, more corporate London crime. The seed is visible in Victorian soil. By the early 1900s, brothers named MacDonald Wog and Wall would be spoken of as running the show, tightening extortion into something like a business plan, and carrying the elephant name into an era of cars, cameras, and league table rivalries with other firms. They would press at the race courses, barter alliances with Birmingham hardmen, clash with the Italian-descended Sabini gang in the 1920s, and send one brother across the Atlantic to reappear, if whispers are to be believed, as a bodyguard in Los Angeles. Those are later pages. In our decade, the tendencies exist, the taste for coordinated betting scams, the habit of taxing rather than merely bruising, the preference for relationships over raids when money lasts longer that way. The crimes listed in charge books from the south of the river men during Victoria's last years read like a catalog of their versatility. Protection rackets, certainly. Assaults and robbery with violence, naturally. Counterfeiting and fraud, when paper could be made to lie. Smash and grabs, with carts or swift legs for flight. Hijacks of horse-drawn wagons on dark stretches, and always gambling to run, to skim, to tilt in one's favor. If a French ring or a dice game needed policing, the elephant would oblige. If a club's doorman needed reminding that he worked in another crew's parish, a word couched as friendship did the job better than a skull cracked, though a skull could be cracked if courtesy failed. Their alliance with the 40 elephants remained a hinge that swung both ways. A woman from the sisterhood might drive a cart. On a jewel raid years on, a man from the mob might, with a nod, settle a matter for a lady who found a rival too impertinent. In mixed rooms, back bars, and private parlors, you could feel the humor of the arrangement, the half-admiring, half-wary respect between crafts. Each thought the other a little mad. Each knew the other could be useful. Each benefited from the other's intelligence and silence. In print, the elephant men seldom enjoyed the full lurid panorama reserved for their East End equivalents. They lived more by rumor, less by headline, yet to pass an evening under their lamps was to understand that London's underworld was not only a matter of nimble fingers and whispered Yiddish in the markets, or of boys shouting titles at alley mouths. It was also a matter of men who could turn a room into a court, a fight into a ledger, a crossroads into a toll gate. If the city is a machine, they were among those who learned to stand where the gears caught and to charge for oiling them. By century's end, pressure from courts and press had taught even these men new manners. The loudest made themselves scarce. The shrewdest kept their boots clean and their voices low. But they did not vanish. They waited at the junction as they had always done, measuring opportunity against risk, counting the night not in hours but in chances. Across the road, the 40 elephants adjusted their seams and went on. Together they framed a South London that the East's legends could not contain a stage with two troops, each rehearsed, each disciplined, each learning to convert the city's appetites into coin. Next, we cross back into a language the press taught London to speak with relish and dread. Hooliganism, the late century panic that turned rough youth into a plague and taught magistrates to reach again for the lash. By the last years of the century, London had learned to give fear a name, and the name this time was jaunty enough to sound like a music hall chorus hooligan. It slipped into the papers sometime about 1894 first in a police court report where it described a cluster of South London roughs with a taste for noise. The word behaved like a drop of ink once fallen. It spread. Within a few summers, it had stained half the headlines about youth crime, and what had long been a familiar nuisance bands of lads busy with windows, fists, and bravado now looked through the fog of a single term, like a plague. The hooligan was every boy at a corner after dark. Hooliganism was everything the respectable wished would go back indoors. Lambeth supplied the emblem. A gang there called them the Hooligan Boys, after the word that claimed them or the name that birthed it, walked the streets as if the pavements were a stage paid for with other people's rates. Their alleged leader was said to be a youth named Charles Clark, or Hooligan. You can hear in the uncertainty how quickly gossip outruns records when a city wants a figurehead. They drank, they smashed, they picked fights. In 1898, the murder of a passerby, Henry Mappin, turned their simmer into a boil. The killing looked senseless because it was a robbery with a knife and more swagger than sense. Inquests are meant to bring facts to ground, but this one lofted fear into the rafters. The coroner, Miss Braxton Hicks, spoke as if delivering an indictment of a species here were young men who scorned honest work, who lived by blackmail, who stormed into shops and offered a simple choice: pay us for beer, or we will turn your livelihood to splinters. His words gave Londoners permission to believe what they had already half decided, that a generation had soured and taken to the streets in packs. The press did the rest. Illustrations swaggered boys in caps, knives glittering beneath lamp glow, crowds parting, windows starred like frosted ponds. The Daily Graphic lamented an avalanche of brutality, as if the whole South Bank were sliding into the river. Other papers joined the chorus, pairing the new word with old dread until hooliganism sounded less like one more season of a street roughness and more like a tide that could sweep ordinary life away. Shopkeepers read and nodded, mothers read and locked doors earlier, policemen read and straightened their backs. Youths, who do not always read but listen keenly, learn to paint the nickname on their own chests like a badge. Name a boy a monster loudly enough, and he will try the costume for his size. There were, even at the time, doubters in print. Reynolds's newspaper, which enjoyed puncturing the self-importance of its rivals, called the whole thing clubhouse panic, a fuss whipped up by gentlemen safe behind brandy and belief. The Daily News urged caution against wild, excited talk, reminding readers that a city that made a theater of its fears would soon mistake its own applause for proof. The numbers did not seem to spike as madly as the mood suggested, but moral panics are weather systems. Once they settle, they obey their own pressure. whatever the barometer says. Committees wrote to the Home Secretary. Clergymen denounced degeneracy from pulpits, and magistrates, who feel the weather first in the court's close air, reached for old remedies with new energy. Punishment declared itself in stern syllables. Terms lengthened. Hard labor returned to the foreground of sentences for robbery with violence, and with it the crank, the treadmill, the oakum that turned hands black with tar and wrists numb with repetition. The lash, reintroduced in the 1860s for garroting, was again spoken of as medicine. A 19-year-old convicted of a rough robbery might hear not only months, not only years, but 20 strokes a number designed to ring in the ears of boys listening in the corridor. The courtroom became a stage for prevention by spectacle. The city, panicked by lads' bravado, answered with estates. Newspapers that loved to terrify readers with knife angles now applauded as the cat-o'-nine tails cracked in their columns like punctuation. Sporting weeklies compared London unfavorably to Liverpool and praised northern judges for scotching their high rips with iron and cat. London, they urged, should do likewise. It pleased them to sound practical. On the pavements, the term did what labels always do: it simplified the map. Any cluster of youths in Lambeth could be hooligans by breakfast and a scourge by supper. The hooligan moved 3 boys behind the passer-by, one arm across the throat to silence, a third. Hand-rifling pockets was not new in technique, only in its glamour of notoriety. Mobs ran together for reasons that would have been intelligible to their grandfather's boredom. Fear, the heat that rises in groups like vapor in a sealed room. Turf mattered as ever. Old quarrels over corners grew new teeth under a name that promised unity without requiring discipline. A boy who might once have thrown a punch and limped home now felt as if he fought under colors. Witnesses felt the pinch most acutely. The practice of intimidation had a brisk efficiency in these years. A shopkeeper who dared to sign a statement found his window starred the next night, his shutters chalked with a mark that looked like a child's scrawl and read like a sentence. A woman who promised to tell what she had seen on the corner was visited by silence from her neighbors. In lanes where everyone needed everyone, that silence bit worse than any epithet. The coroner spoke truth when he said testimony could cost a life. It commonly cost trade, sleep, and peace of mind coin enough to deter the brave from being brave twice. The law's a stronger hand, applied with zeal, yielded results of a sort. Bands split when leaders were jailed for long stretches. Beer houses learned to spot the early signs and refused service with a firmness that saved glass. Policemen on certain beats walked in pairs and found that confidence alone can carry a street for an hour. But the measures also delivered their dry little paradoxes. Boys sent down hard returned harder. The label hooligan, slapped on a forehead at 17, did not wear off at 20. A city that delighted in the new word found it clung like soot. And men who might have married out of the life into work, into responsibility, married later or not at all, because the word followed them into interviews and across thresholds. Panic solved little beyond sensation. Policy, as so often, chased the echo of a headline. Class crept into the panic like background music played too loudly to be remarked upon. When young men with gowns and Latin took out their tempers on a town after a university boat race, the press reported the row as high as spirits, and the magistrates, more often than not, treated it that way. When tradesmen's sons in Lambeth did the same to a milk cart or a shop sign, the word hooligan fell like a gavel, and the sentence followed. Middle-class shoplifters, too, when caught pilfering trifles in the new emporiums, frequently discovered that the embarrassment of their families could be converted into quiet resolution. Poorer women, charged with thefts smaller in value, found themselves painted as irredeemable. The street always knew this double bookkeeping. Panic merely made it common knowledge. If hooligan traveled easily, that is because it was useful. It wrapped a dozen different ills: vandalism, brawling, petty robbery, swagger, into a single, satisfying threat you could point at and promise to defeat. The term leapt borders. Before long, it was at football grounds, in magistrates' notes about seaside towns, in muttered judgments about any boy who laughed too loudly at the wrong hour. The label's afterlife was assured because it solved a rhetorical problem: how to talk about the roughness of youth without having to consider, every time, the streets that schooled it, the wages that failed to hold it, the rooms that pushed it into lanes for air. Say hooligan, and you can borrow the comfort of a plague impersonal, sudden quarantinable, without troubling your conscience much about cures. The hooligan scare of the late 1890s rhymed neatly and unsettlingly with the garroting panic of 30 years earlier. In both, lurid accounts outpaced the ledger. In both, real injuries furnished pretexts for general dread. In both, Parliament and bench reached for exemplary punishments. In both, the public wore new fashions of fear-spiked collars then, new locks and habits now. And in both, the waves receded. By 1900, the worst of the noise subsided. Some boys had been jailed into quiet. Others had simply grown tired, or had found a wage to meet their days, or had learned that caution pays a more regular dividend than fame. The term remained. Words are cheaper to keep than policies are to repeal. What endures, from our vantage, is the pattern. A city overfull of youth and short of light breeds bands. A press tuned to the thrilling chord will play it. A bench conscious of its audience will answer loudly. The result may be some rest at night, and it may also be a generation stamped with a word it did not choose. We can hold both truths without washing either clean, that men like the Lambeth boys hurt others for small profit and large vanity, and that the city found in punishing them a comforting way to ignore the bricks and wages that made such boys so many. The gangs we have walked beside East End crews, immigrant-labeled cliques, South London promoters with fists, and the 40 elephants who turned manners into method belong not to a mythic underworld, but to the world just under the lamps. So the century closes. The gas flares and gutters, the lanes that taught so many lessons are still there, though some have been cut open to air, others rubbed out and redrawn with model estates. The words remain garroter, high-rip, hooligan. They will be repurposed, exported, softened into jokes, stiffened into police jargon. The habits endure longer than the headlines and longer than the court's moods. And listeners like us, quiet historians of the night, are left to remember that the city builds what it fears as diligently as it builds what it loves. In these 15 parts, we have walked the pavements that made the gangs and the gangs that remade the pavements. If sleep takes you now, take with you the map we traced in low-light rooms too small, streets too tight, wages too thin, reputations thick as brick. That is London's undersong. That is how the Boots learned their beat.